Welcome to Terrified Tales, where things are about to get unsettling. Before we dive deeper into the darkness, make sure to like and subscribe. Let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. Are you brave enough to be here at night? Now, relax and let the fear take hold. Story 1. The sun had barely begun to rise over the peaks of the Great Smoky Mountains, casting a soft golden hue across the horizon. The air was crisp, tinged with the earthy scent of damp soil and decaying leaves. A slight breeze stirred the branches, coaxing the chorus of birds to wake, their calls filling the stillness of the morning. Yet this particular hike was different from the others. There was something peculiar in the air, something that made the hairs on the back of Sarah's neck prickle with unease as she and her friends set off down the trail. They had been planning this trip for weeks, eager to escape the weight of city life and immerse themselves in the ancient beauty of the Smokies. Sarah, who had spent her childhood summers hiking through these very forests, had been excited to introduce her friends to the rugged charm of the mountains. They were a tight-knit group, bonded not just by friendship, but by the shared experience of loss and struggle. Each of them carried their own baggage, some heavier than others, and hiking through the wild, untamed forests was, in a way, their way of leaving it all behind. But today, something was different. After a few hours of familiar paths and scenic vistas, they reached the junction of the main trail and a narrow, unmarked path that seemed to disappear into the thick woods. The trees here grew close together, their canopies so dense that it felt as if the sun itself was hesitant to penetrate the shadows below. It was as if the forest itself was hiding something, and the path beckoned with an eerie allure. "Is this a new trail?" John asked, glancing at the others. He was always the one to question their plans, the voice of skepticism that grounded the group. His eyes scanned the surroundings, but there was no sign of the usual trail markers or signs that would indicate a well-traveled path. "I've never seen it on the maps," Sarah replied, pulling out her phone. "It doesn't even show up here." But something about the way the path twisted through the trees felt familiar, as though it had been used for years, despite its absence from any guidebook or digital map. The ground was well worn, the dirt packed down by countless footsteps, and the scent of old pine and moss hung heavy in the air. "I mean, look at it," said Emma, the most adventurous of the group, her voice filled with excitement. "It's perfect. I'm dying to see where it goes." "Sure," Sarah said, trying to suppress her doubts. "Why not? It's not like we've got anything to lose." But as they stepped onto the path, Sarah felt an odd sensation settle over her, a subtle shift, something almost imperceptible but undeniable. It was as if they were crossing into another world, a world that hadn't seen human feet in years, or perhaps even centuries. The air grew still, almost unnervingly so. The usual forest sounds, chirping birds, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of an owl, faded into silence. Not the peaceful, serene quiet of a secluded forest, but a heavy, oppressive stillness that seemed to press in from all sides. The deeper they ventured, the more the atmosphere seemed to change. The trees, tall and ancient, loomed overhead like silent sentinels, their bark weathered by time, their branches tangled in a web of thorns and shadows. The air felt thick, suffocating, as though it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. At first, no one spoke. The silence was unsettling, but they pushed forward, their boots crunching softly on the loose leaves and twigs. Each step felt deliberate, but the path seemed to grow narrower with each turn, the trees closing in around them as though they were being drawn into the heart of the forest. Then they came to a clearing. It wasn't much, just a small space where the trees had parted slightly to allow the light to break through. But it was enough to make them pause. In the center of the clearing stood a half-built wooden bridge, its planks unfinished, jutting out across a shallow creek that trickled lazily below. The structure looked as though someone had started to build it long ago, but then, for reasons unknown, abandoned it midway. The wooden beams were crooked, some jutting out at odd angles, others hastily nailed together in an almost haphazard fashion. "It looks like it was supposed to be a bridge," said Mark, his voice tinged with confusion. "But it's unfinished." "No kidding," Sarah muttered, feeling a shiver run down her spine. She crouched down, brushing her fingers over the rough surface of one of the planks. But the sensation was off. Too cold, too old, as if the wood had been exposed to the elements for far longer than it should have been. The group exchanged uneasy glances, their sense of discomfort growing. "Maybe it's an old construction project," Emma suggested, trying to brush off the strange feeling creeping over them. "It's just abandoned, that's all." But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this place, something that felt wrong. As they continued, they found more oddities. Half-constructed wooden signs, some tilted to the side, others half buried in the dirt, their markings worn away by time and neglect. There were no clear directions, no markers indicating where the trail led or what was to come next. It was as if someone had started something only to walk away from it in haste, leaving everything behind in a rush. Then, just as Sarah was about to suggest they turn back, a flash of color caught her eye. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light, but as she drew closer, she saw it. A backpack sitting on a rock near the edge of the path. It was a bright red pack, large and heavy-looking, with a flap that was slightly open. But what struck her most was the dust. It covered every surface of the bag, thick and almost suffocating, as if it had been left here for months, perhaps even years. "Hey, check this out," Sarah called, kneeling beside the rock. Her heart began to race as she examined the pack. It was filled with supplies, water bottles, a first aid kit, snacks, everything a hiker might need. But there were no footprints around it, no sign of anyone having passed by recently. "Who would leave this here?" Mark asked, crouching beside her. He reached down to touch it, but Sarah quickly stopped him. "Don't," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "It feels wrong." "Yeah, it's been here for a long time," John added, taking a step back. "Whoever left it doesn't seem to have come back for it." A sinking feeling settled in Sarah's chest. She stared at the backpack, trying to make sense of it. Whoever had left it here, they hadn't come back. And somehow, it felt like they never would. "This is too weird," John muttered. "We should turn around." But before anyone could voice their agreement, Emma stepped forward, glancing deeper into the woods. "Look," she said, her voice suddenly hushed. "There's something else up ahead." And there it was. A wooden signpost, half-worn, its surface carved with crude letters. The sign, though barely legible, seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. As they stepped closer, they could make out the single word etched into the wood: "Stay." For a moment, no one spoke. The silence was deafening, thickening around them like a living thing. They all stared at the sign, the word echoing in their minds, reverberating with a strange, almost hypnotic pull. "Stay." It wasn't a suggestion, it was a command. The word "stay" hung in the air, almost as if it had weight, pressing down on them with an invisible force. The stillness around them was unnatural, oppressive, and though the sun remained high in the sky, the shadows seemed to grow deeper, darker, as if something else was slowly overtaking the landscape. The trees around them felt taller now, their trunks twisting unnervingly as if they were reaching for the group. The sense of isolation thickened with each passing second. Sarah was the first to break the silence. "That's," she started, her voice tremulous, unsure of what to say. "That's just strange." The others didn't answer right away, each of them standing in their own private moment of unease. The word "stay" had left them unsettled, like an unwanted presence had entered the very air they breathed. There was something about it, something in the way it seemed to demand their attention that made their skin crawl. It wasn't a warning, it wasn't a request, it was an order. "I don't like it," John said, breaking the tension with his typically blunt tone. "We should head back. This is wrong." But Sarah, always the curious one, couldn't tear her gaze away from the sign. There was something pulling her toward it, something she couldn't quite understand. A feeling, not unlike the urge to touch. A flame, despite knowing it would burn. "Yeah, but what if it's a joke?" Emma suggested, though her voice lacked conviction. "Somebody probably left it here just to mess with us. I mean, it is an old trail, right?" But Sarah's intuition was screaming at her now, louder than anything Emma had said. She turned to face the others, her eyes wide, searching their faces for any sign that they shared the same growing suspicion. "I think we should at least look around, just a little longer. Something's off. I can feel it." "I don't know." Mark hesitated, his brow furrowed in indecision. He was the last to give in to curiosity, the one who always played it safe. His words had the weight of someone who wanted to be convinced, but was too aware of the risk. "Maybe we should just go back. The map's got us on another trail. We don't need to." But as the words trailed off, he seemed to lose his own resolve. Something about Sarah's tone, the way her eyes seemed to be locked on the sign, made him doubt his own instincts. The forest felt too still, too thick with unspoken tension. He could feel his own nerves tightening, like an unseen hand was squeezing his chest. "Come on," Emma urged, her voice a little too eager, perhaps trying to mask her own discomfort. "It's just a sign. What's the worst that could happen?" A cold gust of wind cut through the trees then, whistling through the undergrowth. With an unnatural sharpness, the sudden chill felt like it had come from nowhere, freezing the air around them, even as the sun hung overhead, its warmth barely reaching the floor of the forest. It was enough to break the spell. Without a word, they all turned back toward the path. But something was wrong. The path didn't look the same. The landscape around them seemed altered, as though they had been walking in one direction for hours, but now everything felt unfamiliar. The trail stretched ahead, but the trees that had once seemed distant now pressed in on them from every side. It was the same trail, and yet it wasn't. The foliage was thicker. The ground seemed softer, muddier. They were walking, but it was as if they were moving deeper into a different world. "Wait, this doesn't feel right," Mark said, pausing. His voice trembled slightly now, and he looked around, as if expecting to find the familiar landmarks that would reassure him. But there were none. No moss-covered rocks, no familiar stumps, no winding path that led back to the main trail. It was as if the forest itself had shifted, changed in an instant. "Maybe we took a wrong turn," Emma suggested, her voice thin with uncertainty. "There should be a fork just up ahead." But there was no fork, no sign of any other trail. The woods around them seemed to blur together in an endless stretch of trees, their branches twisting and curving in a way that defied reason. It was like they were walking through an endless labyrinth. "I'm telling you, we're not on the same path anymore," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the beating of her own pulse. She could feel her breath quickening, an unmistakable sense of dread sinking into her bones. "We're lost." The group fell silent, each of them grappling with the same fear. The air around them seemed to press in harder, thicker. It was suffocating. The trees, once so full of life, now seemed to leer at them, their branches clawing toward the sky, their trunks wrapped in dark, curling vines. And then the worst thing happened. The silence. There was no wind now, no sound at all, except for the distant echoing crunch of their boots against the dirt. They walked on, but the forest had become a void, an endless expanse of muted sounds, like they were the only living things in this forgotten corner of the world. "Where are the birds?" Emma whispered suddenly, her voice so low it could have been a secret shared only between the trees. The thought of it sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. There are no birds, no wind, nothing. It was true, the air had grown deathly still. The rustle of leaves, the occasional chirp of a squirrel, the whispering sighs of the trees, all of it was gone. The world around them felt dead, as though the forest was holding its breath. They kept walking, but it felt like the ground itself was shifting beneath them, making the path twist and buckle in strange, unnatural ways. The trees no longer seemed like a comforting presence. They felt like they were closing in, a tightening noose around the hikers' chests. "I think we should turn back," John said, his voice trembling now. "This place, I don't know. It's not right." But as he spoke, the group halted. In front of them stood another structure, just barely visible through the fog-like mist that had begun to envelop the trees. A bridge, built out of the same weathered wood as the first one they had seen, but this one was far worse. The bridge appeared to be crumbling, its timbers warped and splintered, one end teetering dangerously over the edge of a wide, dry ravine. The gap between the wooden slats yawned open like the mouth of some ancient, hungry beast. No one said a word. Then the eerie silence was broken, not by a sound, but by a feeling. A heavy, undeniable pull, as if something was watching them, something just beyond the reach of their understanding, something they had stumbled into by accident, something that was hungry and patient. It was the kind of silence that suffocated you, filled you with the knowing that something was near, but you could never see it. "Let's go back," Mark said again, but there was no urgency in his voice anymore. He spoke as though it was simply a formality, something they had to do, like reading a line from a script they were all following, like actors trapped in some cosmic play they didn't understand. But Sarah knew they couldn't turn back. They were already too deep. She just didn't know yet if they were walking into something worse, or if they were already inside it. The bridge loomed before them, its weathered timbers stretching over the ravine like the bones of something long dead. There was no question about crossing it. Not yet. Not with the way it sagged, the way the air felt thick and oppressive, as though even the very space between them and the other side was alive, watching. The forest had grown denser here, the trees crowding around them, narrowing the space like walls closing in on a trapped animal. "Are we really going to cross this thing?" John asked, his voice shaking slightly, a mix of fear and disbelief. "I don't think we have a choice," Sarah replied, her eyes fixed on the bridge, her breath shallow. She could feel a strange tug at the back of her mind, an irresistible urge to move forward, despite every instinct screaming at her to turn back. Something was pulling them deeper into the forest, and it wasn't just the promise of what lay beyond. It was something darker, something that had been waiting. Mark glanced around, his eyes darting nervously from tree to tree, as if he expected something to step out from behind the trunks. "We can't just stand here. We've got to decide. Either we go back and risk getting even more lost, or we cross and keep moving forward." The decision was made in silence, each of them stepping forward in hesitant steps, as though the very air around them was thick with a sense of foreboding. They crossed the ravine one by one, with Sarah leading the way. Her footfalls echoed in the dead silence as she carefully tested each board beneath her, the rotting wood creaking ominously underfoot. There was something wrong about the way the bridge seemed to stretch on forever, like it was never meant to be crossed. The farther Sarah went, the more the trees around her seemed to warp, their trunks bending unnaturally, their roots rising from the earth like grotesque fingers. For a brief, fleeting moment, Sarah thought she saw something watching them from the shadows, eyes shining like polished stones, flickering in the dimness between the trees. But when she looked again, they were gone. Her heart pounded in her chest. "Did you see that?" she asked breathlessly. But when she turned to the others, their faces were blank, their eyes wide, but not in fear. Not the way hers felt. It was as if they hadn't seen anything at all. "See what?" Mark asked, his voice tight, his steps slow as he crossed the bridge. "It's just the trees." No, there was something," Sarah began, but she stopped herself. What could she say? It was too insane. What was she even seeing? Maybe it was nothing, just shadows playing tricks on her mind. They had to keep moving. The rest of the group crossed the bridge without incident, their boots dragging through the dust. But when they reached the other side, they stopped. The trail that had once seemed so familiar was gone, replaced by a darkened path, lined with trees so close together that they blocked out the light. It was as if they had walked into the belly of a beast, a place where sunlight couldn't touch. A soft whisper passed through the trees. It wasn't the wind, but something far more subtle. It didn't come from any one direction, but from all around them. Sarah's skin crawled at the sensation of invisible eyes on her, watching, waiting. They moved forward, step by cautious step, their feet crunching softly on the underbrush. But there was no relief in the deeper silence. No birds, no squirrels darting from tree to tree. It was just quiet. And then, like a nightmare slipping into their waking world, a voice, low and guttural, reached them from the shadows ahead. "Go. Back," the voice whispered, so faint it could have been a trick of the wind. Sarah froze. She heard it clear as day. "Go back. Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, her pulse racing. "Hear what?" Emma responded, looking around. Her brow furrowed, but she didn't seem as frightened as Sarah felt. "Sarah, there's nothing here. Just calm down." But the voice was there again, only this time it was closer. "Go back. Is someone playing?" "A prank?" John asked, a flicker of annoyance creeping into his voice, but his eyes were wide now, his hands trembling as he looked around too. "Who's messing with us?" Sarah's breath caught. "It's not a prank. Someone, or something, is trying to tell us something. I heard it clearly. Go back." They stood there for what felt like an eternity, the silence between them suffocating. The air around them seemed to bend, to pulse with some unseen force. The trees, which had seemed so distant before, now crowded around them, leaning in, listening. And then, as if summoned by the voice, the mist began to roll in, creeping from the edges of the path, curling around their ankles like a living thing. It was cold, unnaturally cold, and it clung to their legs, thickening by the second, like the forest itself was pulling them deeper. "Guys, we need to leave now," Sarah said urgently, her voice shaking. This isn't right. We're not supposed to be here." But just as she turned to head back toward the bridge, the forest seemed to change. The trees, which had seemed so oppressive before, now felt suffocating. They crowded in even more, their branches snapping into place like locks being turned. "Go back." The voice was louder now, a rasping growl that echoed through the trees, a command that was no longer a whisper. It was a demand, an order. "Go back!" It boomed, this time so powerful that it seemed to shake the very air around them. The ground beneath their feet trembled, just for a moment. A deep, shuddering groan of something ancient, something alive. The mist thickened even more, swirling around them, choking out the remaining light. Sarah could feel the cold seeping into her bones, creeping into her lungs with every breath. The trees moved, their branches twisting and swaying unnaturally, as though they were alive and not just swaying in the wind. "What the hell is happening?" John gasped, his voice high with panic as he stumbled backward, his hand reaching for Sarah's. They were trapped. No matter which direction they turned, the forest was closing in. The trees were bending toward them, the mist swirling like smoke, and the whispering voice was now a growling command. "Run!" Emma screamed, her eyes wide with terror. She turned to sprint back the way they came, but the mist grew thicker, and she vanished into it before Sarah could even react. Emma's voice echoed faintly, her scream torn from her throat. A flash of panic filled Sarah's chest. "Emma!" she shouted, trying to push through the fog. But it swallowed her words, muffling the air, as if even sound was being choked from. The world. The group was splintering. Emma was lost in the mist, and the air was thick with the growling, relentless force that wanted them gone, back. Without thinking, Sarah grabbed John's arm, pulling him toward the only thing that seemed like a way out, the rickety, half-constructed bridge behind them. But as they took their first step toward it, the voice grew louder. It wasn't just a voice anymore. It was a presence, pressing in on them, suffocating them. "Stay! Turn around, Sarah!" John shouted. "We're not safe here, not anymore!" And before Sarah could even reply, the fog closed in again, thick and black. And in that moment she heard something else. A low, terrible growl, like something crawling through the trees. Stay. The mist closed in on them like a living thing, curling and twisting, suffocating their breaths, blocking their sight. The air was thick with something foul, a stench of damp earth and rot, of something long buried. Sarah's skin prickled, her nerves taut with fear. She could hear John's frantic breathing beside her, feel the tight grip of his hand on her arm. He was shaking, but she couldn't tell if it was from the cold or something worse. "Sarah, this isn't right," John gasped, his voice barely more than a whisper, as though speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile illusion of normality that had been left in the wake of the trail's strange twists. She nodded, but the words didn't come. It was as if her voice had been stolen by the forest, like the very air around them was drowning her in its quiet suffocation. The mist seemed to have a weight, pushing them down, urging them to fall to their knees. The trees, the ground, everything around them had become strange and alien. The world they had known was slipping away, piece by piece, leaving them with nothing but an unsettling sense of being hunted. They kept moving, though they had no idea where they were going. There were no more landmarks, no familiar markers. The trail was gone, replaced by a thick darkness that pressed in from all sides. Sarah's foot caught on something hidden beneath the fog, and she stumbled forward, but John was there to steady her. His face was pale, his eyes wide with panic. "We need to get out. We need to get out now." But the trees seemed to groan as they moved, as if they had been waiting for this moment. The wind picked up suddenly, a harsh, jagged gust that cut through the stillness, carrying with it the scent of decay, rotting leaves, wet wood, and something more. Something that made Sarah's stomach churn with an unshakable dread. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her eyes flicking toward the trees. John didn't answer immediately. He was too focused on the shadows that moved among the trunks. At first, it was only a trick of the mist, the play of light and shadow. But then, it was unmistakable. A figure, a shape, someone or something moving between the trees. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but she couldn't move. The figure wasn't human. The silhouette was too long, its limbs too thin, its movement unnervingly smooth. It flickered in and out of sight like a mirage, as though it were part of the forest itself, bound to the trees in a way that defied logic. "John," she said softly, her voice shaking. But John's attention was drawn to the figure now too, and he froze, his eyes locked on the shape, a look of pure terror written across his face. "What the hell is that?" he breathed, his voice barely audible. over the pounding of their hearts. The figure moved again, faster this time, its long limbs stretching unnaturally. It seemed to glide through the fog. Its presence felt more than seen, like the very air around it twisted and bent. The hairs on the back of Sarah's neck stood on end, every cell in her body screaming at her to turn and run. But the fog had thickened, and the path behind them had disappeared. "Stay," the voice said again, and this time it wasn't distant. It wasn't muffled by the mist. It was right in their ears, a low, guttural sound that rumbled through their bones as if the trees themselves were speaking. "Stay," the voice echoed, reverberating through the forest, and for the first time Sarah realized it wasn't a request. It was a command. She turned toward John, her heart pounding, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "We have to get out. We can't." "Stay here. We're not alone." But before she could take another step, the figure lunged forward, closing the distance between them with terrifying speed. It moved like it was a part of the mist, like it was born from the fog itself. Sarah's mind raced, trying to process what she was seeing, but there was no time. It was too fast, too close. The creature emerged from the mist in full, its form coming into focus. It was tall, too tall, its limbs unnaturally long and thin, its skin pale and slick, as if it had been submerged in the wet soil for too long. Its face was the most terrifying thing, not human, not animal. It was featureless, just a smooth, blank surface with dark, empty sockets where eyes should have been. A mouth, if it could be called a mouth, hung open, a gaping hole full of jagged, broken teeth that seemed to shift, grow and twist with each passing moment. "John!" Sarah screamed, stumbling back as the creature reached out with one impossibly long arm, its fingers curling like tendrils ready to grasp her. But before it could touch her, the ground beneath them shook violently. It wasn't an earthquake. It was something else, something unnatural. The earth groaned, and from somewhere deep in the forest there was a loud, terrible crack, like a tree splitting open. But it wasn't a tree. It was something much larger, something ancient. The creature recoiled, as if afraid of whatever was coming. Its head snapped to the side, its featureless face tilting as if listening to the sound. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished back into the fog, its form fading into the mist like smoke carried away by the wind. For a moment, there was nothing. Only the heavy silence, punctuated by the pounding of Sarah's heart. She could feel the tension in the air, a terrible pressure building around them. The creature had vanished, but the danger wasn't gone. "What the hell was that?" John whispered, his voice hoarse with fear. He was shaking, his face pale as he looked around them, but the fog had thickened so much that he could barely see his own hand in front of his face. "I don't know, but it's not over," Sarah replied, her voice barely audible. Her mind was racing, trying to comprehend what she had seen, what they had just escaped. And then she felt it, a shift in the air, the presence, the watching eyes. It was back. Something was out there in the fog, just beyond their reach, watching them, waiting. "I think we're being hunted," Sarah whispered, her throat tight. The trees shifted again, as if they were closing in. The air felt colder now, colder than it had ever been. The mist had grown thicker, and the growling, guttural voice was back, louder this time. "Stay." It wasn't a request anymore, it was a command, and this time Sarah knew. There was no way out, no turning back. They were part of this place now. The mist thickened even further, swallowing the world around them. The once familiar trees now seemed to stretch endlessly, their twisted, gnarled limbs like skeletal hands clawing at the heavens. The cold seeped deeper into Sarah's bones, turning her blood to ice. Every step felt heavier, each breath a struggle against the oppressive weight of the fog. The air itself seemed to grow thicker, almost solid, pressing down on them, smothering them with its invisible force. Sarah. "Sarah, what's happening?" John's voice cracked, a desperate tremor beneath his words. He was clinging to her now, his grip tight, but his eyes were wide with a panic she hadn't seen before. His earlier bravado had evaporated, leaving only raw terror. The man who had been ready to press on just hours ago was now trembling like a leaf in the wind. We need to keep moving," Sarah said, though she could barely bring herself to believe it. Her mind was fogged with dread, but the urge to escape, to flee from whatever was stalking them, was overpowering. She couldn't let herself think. Not yet. If they stopped, she feared they might never leave. And yet, even as she spoke the words, she felt the pull of the forest's unnatural silence. It had become something like a force, like the very land itself had reached out to claim them. With every step they took, the path seemed to shift. The trees grew denser, the shadows deeper, the ground softer, as if they were moving through a dream that twisted at its edges. Sarah could feel the weight of something dark looming over them, a presence that was not human, not animal, but something far older, something tied to the earth itself. The whispers, too, were back. Low, guttural, an unintelligible language that came from everywhere and nowhere all at once. It wasn't wind, it wasn't the forest. It was something older, something that had been waiting, watching. The figure in the mist was gone, but it hadn't disappeared completely. Sarah could still feel its presence lingering just out of sight, moving just beyond the edge of her vision. She was certain of it now. The thing that had stalked them earlier, with its elongated limbs and faceless form, wasn't alone. The forest was full of them. "Sarah, stop!" John hissed, yanking at her arm. She turned to face him, her own fear a reflection of his, but his eyes were wide with something darker than terror now. His gaze was fixed on the ground ahead. The earth beneath them was no longer solid. It had become spongy, like wet clay, giving way beneath their feet with each step they took. And there, in the soft earth, were deep indentations, footprints. They weren't human. They were much larger, the toes long and thin like claws, and they were fresh, still damp. They were moving in the same direction they were headed. "No," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling as she tried to take a step back. No, it can't be real." But the mist parted for a moment, and in the fleeting gap, she saw it. A form, silhouetted against the dark, the faint outline of something tall, standing unnaturally still. The fog closed in again, but for a heartbeat, she had seen its shape, clearly, and it was coming toward them. "Run!" she screamed, and she didn't wait for John to follow. She tore off in the opposite direction, her heart hammering, her legs burning with the effort, but the ground seemed to pull at her feet, slowing her, dragging her back, as though the very earth itself were trying to swallow her whole. John's footsteps echoed behind her, frantic and heavy. Sarah. Stop, wait, but she couldn't. She couldn't stop. The air was thick with a dread she couldn't name, and her feet carried her forward despite the fear gnawing at her insides. She pushed harder, stumbling over rocks and roots, not daring to look back, knowing that whatever was following them was gaining. The mist parted again, and for just a moment she glimpsed something out of the corner of her eye. The figure, tall, lanky, with the same elongated limbs, was watching them. It wasn't running. It wasn't even moving. It just stood there. Its face was still blank, smooth, featureless, but Sarah could feel the weight of its gaze. The forest felt alive with it, with them. Sarah didn't know how much time had passed. It felt like hours, but the mist was still thick around them. Her lungs burned. Her legs felt like lead. But they couldn't stop. They couldn't. The path had changed again. There were no more footprints. There was no more trail. They were lost. And then, just as she thought they couldn't go any further, she saw it. A house, a small, dilapidated cabin, its windows broken, its door hanging from one hinge. It appeared from the fog as if it had always been there, hidden in the depths of the forest, waiting for them to stumble upon it. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't much, just a shack, weathered and broken, but it was something. She stopped, her heart thudding in her chest. "John, look." He stopped beside her, his eyes wide with exhaustion and terror, but even in his panic he was drawn to the cabin. "Is that real?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "I don't know," Sarah breathed, feeling the weight of the decision. But she felt it deep in her gut, a pull, something urging her to go to the cabin. It was wrong. It was so wrong. But it was their only option. They crossed the threshold of the house without another word, the door creaking on its rusted hinges as they pushed it open. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the smell of rot and mildew. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, the floor uneven and slick with damp. But it was safe. It felt like a sanctuary in this terrible place, or at least that's what she told herself. "Where are we?" John whispered, his voice small as if he had given up on understanding. "I don't know," Sarah murmured, her hand trembling as she touched the cold stone of the fireplace. It was abandoned. The room felt empty, cold, as if no one had lived there for years. But there was something off about it. The silence was too heavy, too thick, and that was when they heard it. The softest sound, a whisper, a slow, deliberate scraping noise, like something moving just beyond the walls. "Stay," the voice said again, but this time it was not in the mist. It was inside the cabin, echoing from the very walls themselves. John stepped backward, his eyes wide. "It's here. It's in the house." The walls seemed to press in on them, the space closing in tighter, the air growing colder. They had crossed into its domain. The creature had been waiting, and now the price of staying was clear. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, like the slow, grinding rhythm of some unseen machine. The air in the cabin felt thick with the presence of something ancient, something hungry. Sarah's breath came in shallow gasps, and her skin crawled with an unsettling sense of inevitability. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but her feet were rooted to the floor, unwilling to move. John was the first to break the silence, his voice barely audible but tinged with desperation. "We need to leave. Now." His eyes darted around. The cabin, searching for an escape. But it felt as though the very walls were closing in, as though the cabin itself were a trap, waiting to snap shut. The whisper echoed again, impossibly close. "Stay." It wasn't a voice anymore. It was a command, a deep, guttural sound that seemed to emanate from every direction, from the walls, the floor, the air itself. And then a noise that made Sarah's blood run cold, the scraping sound. Something shifting, moving, dragging itself along the floorboards beneath them. John's face contorted with fear, his eyes wild. "Sarah, what the hell is that?" Before she could answer, a shadow moved in the corner of her vision. It wasn't human. The mist from the forest had followed them, creeping through the cracks in the walls, swirling around the room like a living thing. It coalesced into a figure, tall, lanky, its limbs stretched impossibly long, moving with the same unnatural grace she had seen in the forest. The featureless face was there again, looming just out of reach, its mouth opening wide, revealing rows of jagged, shifting teeth that seemed to twist and grow as it drew closer. It wasn't alone. The walls of the cabin groaned, creaking as though something was moving inside them, just beneath the surface. The scraping noise came again, and this time Sarah realized it was not just one creature. There were more. Hundreds. The entire house was alive with them, the walls, the floors, even the very air trembling with their presence. She could feel their cold eyes watching her from every direction. It's not real. It can't be real, she whispered to herself, the words falling from her lips like a prayer. But they were real. They were here, and they had been waiting for her. The figure in the corner reached out with one long, twisted arm, its fingers stretching, elongating like tendrils reaching for her. The mist filled the room now, heavy and thick, suffocating. She could barely see through it, but she could feel the presence of the creatures all around her, closing in, circling her like predators. The air grew colder. The mist curled around her legs, her arms, binding her in place. She could no longer move. The walls were pressing in. The whisper, "Stay," reverberated through her skull, relentless, deafening. Her heart hammered in her chest as she struggled to breathe, her limbs frozen. With terror, "Sarah!" John's voice cracked, pulling her back to the moment. "We can't stay here. We have to get out, now!" But the door, the only way out, was no longer visible. It had disappeared. The house was a maze now, shifting around them, its walls undulating like flesh, pulsating with an unnatural rhythm. A cold laugh echoed from the shadows, the voice deep and hollow, almost like it came from the very earth itself. "You cannot leave. You are mine." Sarah's legs gave out beneath her, and she sank to her knees, her hands trembling as she pressed them against the floor. It was too much. The air was suffocating, the pressure unbearable. Her vision blurred as the fog grew thicker, denser, and... Then through the haze she saw it, the thing that had been watching them, waiting. The figure, its form now clear, its body twisted and alien, standing just at the threshold of the room. It smiled, or at least its mouth stretched wide in a grotesque semblance of a smile, revealing rows of teeth that seemed to go on forever, each one sharp and jagged like the shards of broken glass. "It's too late," the creature whispered. Its voice was the sound of 1,000 whispers, echoing inside her skull. "You've already made the choice." Sarah felt her heart lurch in her chest. The weight of the creature's words crashed over her like a tidal wave. She realized then, truly realized, that they hadn't been running toward freedom. They hadn't been seeking escape. They had been drawn here, lured by the whispers, by the promise of something they didn't understand. And now, there was no way out. John's voice, weak and full of terror, reached her through the fog. "Sarah, we're trapped." But Sarah didn't hear him. She could feel it now, like a cold hand wrapping around her heart, squeezing tighter with each passing second. She had made a mistake. They all had. They had stepped into the wrong place, walked the wrong path, and there was no turning back. "Stay." The word echoed again, louder this time, ringing in her ears like a deafening gong. Her mind was slipping, unraveling, her thoughts becoming tangled. In the voice that surrounded her, there was no escape. The figure moved toward them, its limbs stretching, bending in unnatural angles, its face still featureless, empty. Its hands reached out, long fingers twisting as they came closer, brushing the air around her skin like cold, damp tendrils. And then everything went silent. The mist, the whispers, the creatures, they all vanished in an instant, leaving nothing behind but the hollow, suffocating silence. The cold that had wrapped itself around her disappeared, leaving Sarah standing alone, gasping for breath. The cabin was empty again, its walls still and lifeless. John was gone. The air was still. She was left with only the echo of the word, "Stay." It was all that remained. Sarah's breath was ragged, the air in the cabin thick with a quiet dread that pressed down on her chest. The figure, the creature, was gone, but its presence lingered in the corners of her mind, a cold shadow that would not lift. Her heart raced, her limbs trembling. and she found herself unable to move for a moment, trapped in the oppressive stillness. The fog had not only disappeared from the room, but it had vanished from her vision entirely, leaving nothing but the darkness of the forest outside the window. The house had returned to its decayed, lifeless state, and yet the strangeness still hung in the air, like the aftermath of some unspeakable event. It was quiet now. Too quiet. Her fingers grazed the cold stone of the fireplace again, as though trying to ground herself in reality, but her mind was a storm, swirling with confusion and fear. John was gone. The sound of his voice, his desperate cries, was no longer there. He had vanished just as surely as the mist had. Had he ever been here at all? Or had he been another figment, another illusion created by the entity that still haunted her thoughts? John? Her voice cracked, a whisper swallowed by the vast emptiness of the cabin. She had no idea if she was even speaking to anyone, or if she was just trying to convince herself that she was still sane, still real. The air felt thinner now, as though it had been drained of all warmth, all life. The weight of the silence was unbearable, and Sarah felt herself slipping inch by inch into madness. She forced her eyes to look around the room again, but there was nothing here. No sign of John, no trace of any living being. Only the broken furniture, the dust, and the damp decay that clung to the walls like an old, forgotten memory. But then something caught her eye. Something small, hidden in the far corner of the room, half covered by a tattered rug. It looked like a piece of paper, yellowed with age, its edges frayed and torn. Sarah hesitated, unsure whether the sight was real or another trick of the mind. She had seen so many illusions since entering this cursed place. It was impossible to know what to trust anymore. But something compelled her to move. She approached it slowly, each step uncertain, her pulse quickening. She bent down, her hands shaking, and lifted the rug from the floor. There it was, a small, folded sheet of paper. The handwriting was old, but legible, scrawled in dark ink. It looked familiar, though Sarah couldn't quite place why. Her fingers, trembling, she unfolded it. The message was simple. You must stay. There is no way out. It was the same as the word on the signpost, the word that had haunted them in the woods. Stay. The meaning behind the message clawed at her. She could feel it now. The weight of the words pressing down on her, the unmistakable power they held. She wasn't just in some random cabin. She was inside the heart of something ancient, something that had been waiting for her, pulling her deeper into its grip. But the letter, her hands were trembling violently as she read it again, hadn't been written in her own time. It was much older. The ink was fading, and the paper itself was brittle, like something that had been left behind for years, decades, maybe even longer. A cold chill crept over Sarah. She could feel it. She wasn't alone here. No, this house, this place, was not just a physical space. It was an anchor, a prison. She didn't know how she knew it, but she did. The entity, whatever it was, had existed for a long time, longer than she could comprehend. It wasn't just waiting for her to enter the woods. It had been here, in this cabin for centuries, growing stronger with each passing year, each new victim that found their way into the unmarked trail. Her mind raced. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to grow darker, thicker, as if the house was breathing around her. The fog outside the window began to swirl again, though it had no real shape, just a twisted, oppressive mist that obscured everything. Beyond the glass, and through it, the trees looked wrong, too tall, too twisted, as though they had grown to unnatural heights, bending toward the cabin as if trying to pull it down, suffocate it. Stay. She gripped the letter tightly, pressing it to her chest, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. What had she done? Was she trapped here forever, just like those before her? Her stomach churned, the sense of doom overwhelming. But there was one thing she knew with a terrible certainty now. She had to escape. She could feel the weight of the curse closing in around her, pulling tighter and tighter like a noose around her neck. She bolted to her feet, desperate, her legs weak beneath her. The door was no longer just a door. It had become a symbol, a barrier, something that was being willed into existence by the force that ruled this place. If she could just get out, if she could break through whatever this was, maybe there would still be a chance. She rushed to the door and yanked at the handle, but it was locked. She pulled harder, her panic rising, but it didn't budge. She tried again, throwing her weight against it, but it remained stubbornly closed. She pounded her fists against the wood, screaming in frustration. "Stay." The word echoed in her mind. Again, a constant, oppressive presence that she couldn't escape. She slammed her fists into the door once more, her voice breaking as she yelled for help, though she knew no one was coming. Then, suddenly, the house groaned. The walls trembled. The floor beneath her feet seemed to ripple, as though the entire structure was alive, responding to her desperation. The mist outside seemed to push in, flooding through the cracks of the cabin, like a living, breathing entity. And as the fog spilled into the room, Sarah saw him. John. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. He stood in the doorway, but he wasn't looking at her. He was looking past her, into the deep shadows that swirled in the corners of the room, as if waiting for something to emerge from the darkness. His lips moved, but no sound came out. "John!" Sarah cried, rushing toward him, her heart lifting. For a moment, as she reached out to him. But as she drew closer, his form began to shift. His body blurred, flickering like a dying candle flame. He was fading, disappearing, as if he was never truly there. His figure turned into mist, then vanished entirely, leaving only the empty doorway in his place. The fog crept further into the cabin, swallowing everything. And as it did, Sarah felt it. The presence, the thing that had been watching them. It was here. It had always been here, and now it was going to make her stay forever. The room was still, the air cold and damp. But now it was suffused with a thick, suffocating tension that made every breath feel like a battle. Sarah stood frozen, her chest tight, heart thudding with panic. The mist had crept in, swirling around, the cabin like a living thing, and the silence was deafening. Every corner seemed to pulse with an oppressive energy, the shadows moving of their own accord, drawing closer, folding in on her like a noose tightening around her neck. She could feel it now, the true weight of the curse. It wasn't just that she was trapped. It was that she was being watched, as if her every move, every thought was being observed, scrutinized by something far older and far darker than she could ever understand. And the worst part? It wasn't just an entity waiting to claim her. It was something that knew her, that understood her deepest fears, her most intimate weaknesses. It was the kind of horror that crept under your skin, wrapping itself around your soul until you didn't even know where you ended. And it began. But there was something else, something more unsettling, floating just beneath the surface of her terror, something familiar. The figure of John fading before her eyes, the way he had vanished into the fog like a wisp of smoke, like a memory she couldn't quite hold on to. He was gone. And yet in her mind, she kept hearing his voice, low and far away, calling her name, Sarah. Sarah. The mist thickened, swirling more rapidly, and then, out of it, came the sound of soft, wet footsteps. Slowly, too slowly, like a predator savoring every moment of its approach. She turned toward the sound, dread flooding her veins, her pulse quickening. There, emerging from the fog, was a figure, tall and skeletal, with thin, elongated limbs that dragged along the floor with each movement. It was wearing something familiar, her breath caught in her throat. The figure was dressed in ragged clothes, but they looked so familiar, so right, like something from a memory she hadn't known she had. The torn coat, the worn boots. It was John's coat, but it wasn't John. The thing stepped fully into the cabin's dim light, revealing its face, or what used to be a face. It was a grotesque parody of a human being, its skin stretched tight over bones, its mouth a wide, gaping hole that seemed to lead into endless darkness. The eyes, hollow and empty, fixed on her with a hunger that felt all too familiar. John's coat, John's soul, had been swallowed by this thing, consumed and twisted into something far darker, far more malevolent. The face that stared back at her wasn't him anymore. It was an echo, a mockery of him, drawn from her own memories and fears. Sarah. It whispered in a voice that echoed, like it came from deep within the earth. You should have stayed. It was close now, the smell of decay and rot filling the air as it loomed over her, the figure's shape warping and flickering in the mist. She could feel it, a pull, an invisible force tugging at her, trying to reel her in, to pull her into its waiting maw. The cold that emanated from it sunk into her bones, freezing her in place. Her thoughts scrambled, desperately trying to find some way out. Stay, the word, that cursed word, echoed in her mind, the promise of the entity that had bound her to this place. And she realized, with a sickening twist in her stomach, that it wasn't just the house that had lured her in. It was the forest, the unmarked trail that she had walked down. It had been waiting for her. All of it had been set up for her, drawn in by some invisible thread that had connected her to this nightmare. It wasn't a place anymore. It was a living thing. The mist swirled faster and she staggered backward, the cold pressing in on her, like a vice. The figure advanced again, its skeletal fingers twitching, hungry. Sarah felt the darkness closing in, suffocating her, the walls of the cabin beginning to pulse with the rhythm of her heartbeat. The thing that had once been John was mere inches away now, its mouth opening wider, revealing a void that seemed to go on forever. John. Her voice cracked, barely a whisper, as she reached toward it, her fingers trembling, desperate for some trace of the person she had once known. John, please, I'm sorry. Please, I didn't mean... But the thing was no longer listening. It lunged, its arms snapping out like whips, grabbing her by the shoulders and pulling her into its cold, suffocating embrace. And then, darkness. When Sarah opened her eyes again, she was no longer in the cabin. The room had vanished, replaced by an endless stretch of mist, thick and choking. The fog clung to her skin like a second layer of clothing, heavy and oppressive. The air was cold, but it wasn't the sharp bite of winter. It was something deeper, something colder, like the grave itself. She was standing in the middle of a wide, empty forest. The trees loomed around her like ancient, gnarled giants, their twisted branches reaching for the sky, their bark dark and slick like blood-soaked skin. The ground beneath her feet was soft, spongy, and damp with moisture. It felt wrong, like the very earth was alive, watching her. And there, just at the edge of the mist, stood the signpost. The sign was carved from wood, old and worn, and yet it seemed to glow faintly in the dim light of the fog. It was the same sign she had seen earlier in the cabin, but now the word was different. The word was no longer stay, it was come. She reached for the sign, drawn to it as if by some invisible force. Her body moved of its own accord, her mind screaming at her to stop, but her feet betrayed her, carrying her forward, closer to the beckoning sign. It was as if the forest itself was calling her, urging her to step deeper into its darkened embrace. Sarah tried to turn away, to run, but her legs felt like they were made of stone. The trees leaned in closer, their branches twisting together to form a barrier, trapping her, guiding her path. The whisper came again, now a soft, comforting murmur. "Come to me, Sarah. Come to me and stay." The fog thickened around her, swallowing her whole, and she felt herself slipping away, her mind unraveling like thread from a needle. The thing, the entity, was here, in the woods, in the trees, in the very air she breathed. It was always with her, always watching. And now, Sarah knew the truth. There was no escaping. The forest was silent. The mist clung to the trees like a shroud, thick and oppressive, swallowing every trace of light, until all that remained was a soft, ghostly glow that seemed to come from nowhere at all. Sarah couldn't tell if the fog was natural or if it was some manifestation of the force that held her captive. Either way, it had become her only companion, its damp fingers wrapping around her, coaxing her deeper into the heart of the woods. She could no longer see the cabin, or the signpost, or even the trail she had once walked. All she could see were the trees, twisted and dark, their branches reaching out like long, gnarled fingers. She couldn't move now. She couldn't even breathe without the air feeling heavy in her chest, like the world itself was suffocating her. And then, in the quiet, she heard it. A voice. Soft, distant, and faint, but unmistakable. It was familiar. Too familiar. Sarah. She froze, her heart racing. The sound of her name echoed through the forest, not like a whisper on the wind, but with a strange, hollow resonance, as if it came from somewhere deep beneath the earth. She spun around, eyes searching, desperate for any sign of life. The trees were still, the shadows silent. "John?" Her voice trembled as she called into the fog, but the mist seemed to swallow her words, suffocating them before they could travel. She stepped forward, one foot uncertainly placed in front of the other, hoping for a response. Anything to break the unbearable silence. But the answer came not from the air, but from the earth itself. The ground beneath her shifted, barely perceptible, but enough for her to feel it. The soil moved, like something was stirring below, pushing against the weight of the earth. It was subtle, like the pulse of something ancient and restless, its roots spreading beneath her, touching everything in the forest. The trees themselves groaned as if in pain, their branches creaking under the pressure of some unseen force. The whispers grew louder. Sarah. She took another step forward, and then another, as if something was guiding her, pulling her toward the unknown. The trees parted, revealing a small clearing ahead. It was a place Sarah recognized, though she could not say how. The ground was covered with brittle leaves, and the trees formed a perfect circle around the center, like guardians waiting for something or someone to arrive. There, in the center of the clearing, was a large weathered stone. The stone was marked with strange symbols, carvings that seemed to pulse with a faint, almost imperceptible light, as if the stone itself was alive. She didn't know why, but she felt an overwhelming compulsion to touch it. Without thinking, her hand reached out, her fingers brushing the surface of the stone. The moment she made contact, a jolt of cold electricity shot up her arm, and the ground beneath her feet seemed to shift violently, as though the very roots of the forest were waking from a long slumber. The symbols on the stone flared to life, glowing with an eerie, unnatural light. The mist swirled around her, tightening, suffocating, and the whispers became clearer, more insistent. They were no longer just calling her name. They were chanting, a rhythmic, hypnotic chant that seemed to resonate with the very core of her being, the roots, the forest itself. It was alive. A memory, long buried, suddenly surged to the surface of her mind, unbidden and sharp. It was of a story her grandmother had once told her, one that had always seemed so distant, so unimportant. The story of a woman lost in the woods who had found a path that didn't exist on any map. A hidden trail that led to something ancient, something beyond the realm of understanding. The woman had wandered deeper and deeper into the forest, drawn by voices, by whispers that promised answers, by promises of freedom, of understanding. But when she finally found the source of those whispers, she discovered the truth. The forest wasn't just a place. It was a being, a god, an ancient force, with roots so deep in the earth that it could weave itself into the fabric of time itself. And the whispers weren't calls for help, they were commands, commands that demanded to be answered. Sarah stumbled, back from the stone, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she realized the truth. The forest had been waiting for her bloodline. For her, she had heard stories about the Great Smoky Mountains, the hidden places, the trails that seemed to disappear into the mist, and the strange disappearances that dotted the history of the area. But none of them ever mentioned this. The thing that haunted this place wasn't a ghost or some wandering spirit. It was a living, breathing entity that fed on memories. It twisted the past, pulled at the threads of time, and drew its power from the lost souls that wandered into its grasp. Those who entered never left. They became part of the forest, their souls entangled in its ancient roots, feeding its hunger. And now, Sarah realized with a sickening jolt, it wasn't just John who had become part of this twisted landscape. She had known it all along, deep in her gut. But the realization hit her with the force of 100 memories slamming into her, all at once. She had been here before. She was part of this story. Part of the forest's endless cycle. Sarah, she spun around, heart slamming in her chest. The voice was clearer now, louder, more insistent, coming from behind her. It wasn't John this time. It was the woman from the story. The one who had come before her, lost in the woods, lured by the same whispers, the same promises. The figure emerged from the mist, slowly, deliberately, and Sarah felt a chill unlike any she had ever known. The woman was familiar, and yet completely unfamiliar. Her face was pale, her hair dark and wild, her clothes torn and ragged, as though she had been here for far too long. Her eyes were empty, hollow, like two dark pits that swallowed the light. Around them, "Join us," the woman whispered, her voice a low rasp like a broken record. "You belong here now." The forest shifted again, the air thickening, the roots stirring beneath the soil, pulling Sarah in, making her feel lighter, weaker, as though she was being untethered from reality itself. The woman reached out, her fingers cold, skeletal, and Sarah's body moved against her will, drawn toward her like a moth to a flame. She couldn't fight it, couldn't resist. There was no escape. And then, before she could speak, the ground beneath her cracked wide. Open! The earth split beneath Sarah's feet, a chasm opening wide and yawning like some monstrous, hungry mouth. She didn't even have time to scream before she was falling, plunging into the darkness, the wind rushing past her in a cold, shrill cry. It felt like the world was being ripped apart, like the very fabric of reality was unraveling with her descent. Her stomach lurched as the earth seemed to spin around her, the shadows stretching and twisting, distorting her senses. For a moment, she was weightless, disconnected from her body, as if she were suspended in a nightmare. And then she hit the ground. The impact wasn't harsh, though. It was soft, almost gentle, like the earth itself had swallowed her whole. But when Sarah opened her eyes, the world was not what it should have been. She lay on her back, staring up into a sky that wasn't a sky at all, but a shifting mass of dark, churning clouds. Clouds that flickered with an eerie light, as though the heavens themselves were trapped in the throes of some ancient agony. The ground beneath her felt different too. Not solid earth, but something far more alien. It was as if she were lying on the surface of an ancient, forgotten realm, one that had been buried beneath the earth for centuries, perhaps millennia. The soil was soft, moist and dark like a rich loam, but there was no scent of pine or earth here. Instead, it smelled faintly of decay, of something long dead. And yet there was something pulsing in the air, alive, in a way that made her skin crawl. Slowly, Sarah pushed herself up, her hands sinking into the soft ground as she looked around. The mist had followed her, creeping into the chasm with her, swirling around her feet, thickening with each passing second. But what struck her most was the overwhelming sense of silence. No birds, no wind, no sounds of the world at all. Just the steady, rhythmic pulse of her own heartbeat and the whispering, mocking calls that echoed through the chasm. Her feet were still heavy, like they were weighed down by invisible chains, each step a struggle against the pull of the earth. But when she managed to stand, she saw it, the thing that had been calling her, the woman. She stood at the far edge of the chasm, her pale form flickering like a wisp of smoke in the swirling mist. Her eyes, hollow and empty, locked onto Sarah's, and Sarah felt a deep, gnawing dread clawing at her chest. The woman's mouth opened wide in a grotesque smile, revealing teeth far too sharp, far too many. And as her lips parted, the words came, not spoken but felt, pressed directly into Sarah's mind. "It is time," the woman said. Her voice wasn't a whisper now. It was a command, an urgent demand that made Sarah's stomach twist. "You are part of the forest. You always have been. You just needed to remember." With that, the woman raised one bony hand, and Sarah's world shifted violently. The ground beneath her feet rumbled, sending tremors through the air. And then, with a sickening twist, the chasm began to move. Sarah stumbled back, her eyes wide with terror as the earth shifted, revealing the twisted roots of massive trees that seemed to be alive, crawling and stretching like serpents deep within the soil. The roots writhed and pulsed, growing larger and more grotesque with each passing second, pushing their way through the ground and tearing it apart. They reached toward the sky, thick and knotted, their dark bark covered in strange glowing symbols that shifted like liquid light. The trees began to move as well, their massive trunks bending and stretching, groaning as they swayed, their branches shaking with unnatural force. The entire forest was coming to life, awakening from its long slumber. The very roots of this cursed place had been dormant for centuries, perhaps longer, waiting for someone, waiting for her. The woman's form flickered again, her face contorting, with the force of an inhuman laugh, a laugh that seemed to shake the very fabric of the forest itself. The trees around Sarah creaked, their branches groaning like something ancient had stirred deep within them. The mist thickened again, swirling tighter, denser, the air turning from cold to suffocating. "Come," the woman intoned, extending her hand toward Sarah, beckoning her forward. "The forest welcomes you." For a moment, Sarah couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. Every instinct within her screamed to run, to fight, to break free from the nightmare that was closing in around her. But then the thought struck her. What if there was no escape? What if she had already been trapped here from the moment she'd taken that first step down the unmarked trail? What if she had never left? And in that moment, Sarah remembered. The stories her grandmother had told her, the ones about the ancient forest god that haunted the land, the one that called to those with blood ties to the old ones. The roots of the past, they called it. The dark, ancient power that drew those who were meant to become part of the forest. She wasn't just lost. She had been chosen, bound. Her bloodline had always been tied to this place, to the forest, and the spirits that fed on lost souls. The realization hit her like a slap in the face. She was the forest's next offering, its next sacrifice, and her connection to it was deeper than she could ever have known. She wasn't just trapped here by circumstance. She was here because the forest had invited her. But before she could fully process the weight of that truth, a shriek pierced the air, so sharp and sudden that it made her ears ring. She turned in horror, but saw nothing, only darkness, swirling and shifting in the mist. Then the ground trembled again. This time, it wasn't just the earth moving. It was something else. The roots of the trees pulled, creaked, and snapped, tearing free from the earth with a sickening, grinding sound. One by one, the trees began to fall toward Sarah, and in their wake the whispers turned to screams. "Join us! Join us!" With no time to react, Sarah felt something yank her forward, dragging her into the fog and toward the roots that reached out, writhing like serpents hungry for their prey. The woman's voice echoed in her mind, an irresistible force. "You belong to us now, Sarah. The roots of the past claim you." And as the roots closed in and the shadows swallowed her whole, Sarah realized the truth too late. There was no escape. Not for her. Not for anyone who had entered this place. The darkness engulfed Sarah, a void that sucked in every shred of her being, as though the very air around her had been consumed by the forest itself. The roots of the ancient trees pulsed around her, their bark slick and cold against her skin. She couldn't tell if she was being pulled down into the earth or pulled into herself. The lines between the two had become blurred, the forest intertwining with her thoughts, making her question what was real and what was merely the product of her mind's unraveling. Her body felt numb, detached. Every movement was sluggish, as though she was swimming through tar, every breath heavy and thick, like she was breathing water. The screams of the trees, their calls to join them, echoed in her head, growing louder and louder until they became a cacophony, a maddening, all-consuming sound. The mist closed in around her like a living thing, its tendrils curling around, her legs dragging her deeper into the depth. Sarah, the voice, that voice. It came from everywhere and nowhere all at once, wrapping itself around her mind, pulling her deeper into the heart of the forest. She couldn't escape it. It was like an itch that wouldn't go away, an unrelenting pull that tugged at the very core of her being. Her grandmother's words echoed in her memory, the old stories she'd whispered at bedtime when the world felt safe, when the forest was still just a place to visit, not to be trapped inside. But now the forest was part of her. It had always been. "Sarah, listen to me." The voice was more distinct now. The tone was familiar, so very familiar. John's voice, the man she had lost in the woods, the man who had become a distant memory, now revived in this hollow place, his voice distorted by the forest's hunger. His voice wasn't just a sound, though. It was something deeper, something primal. It felt like an echo of his soul, tethered to the very heart of the land. Sarah opened her eyes. The roots, the mist, the chasm, they had all disappeared. Instead, she stood in an endless stretch of twilight, a place where the sky was thick with red and black clouds, swirling in unnatural patterns. The ground beneath her was hard and smooth, a sharp contrast to the forest's loamy, damp earth. It felt wrong in every way. She wasn't where she had been before. She wasn't in the forest anymore either. She was standing on the edge of a great hollow. Before her, a vast pit opened up, an abyss so deep that it seemed to stretch into eternity. The air above it shimmered, as though the very air had been warped, distorted by some malevolent force. And within the pit, she couldn't see the bottom, but she could feel it, a gnawing, hungry pull, like the hole itself was a mouth, waiting to swallow everything in its reach. And there, standing at the edge of the pit, was John. At least it looked like him. His figure was translucent, flickering, like a faulty light caught between two worlds. His features were blurred, his expression twisted with an emotion that Sarah couldn't place. Sorrow, pain, rage. His eyes, though. His eyes were the only thing that remained solid, and they locked onto hers with a burning intensity, as though he was pleading with her. "Sarah," he said, his voice barely a whisper, the sound drowned by the swirling chaos around them. His image flickered again, and for a moment, Sarah thought he might disappear completely, but instead he stepped forward, closer, his translucent form seeming to materialize more clearly. "You have to listen to me." Sarah felt a strange pressure in her chest, a weight pulling at her very heart. It wasn't the weight of grief, not anymore. It was something heavier, older, like 1,000 forgotten memories crashing into her all at once. This was the part of the forest she'd never been told about, the place where the forest's hunger was most insidious. It fed on loss, it fed on the past, on regret, on the souls that wandered too far into its grasp, never to return. "You don't belong here," John's voice broke through the growing chaos. "You don't have to be part of it. I didn't want this for you." But his words were drowned out by the groaning of the forest around her. The pit seemed to grow, the edges of it stretching wider, its dark maw threatening to swallow the entire world. The air grew thick with a suffocating pressure, a hum that made her skin prickle with something close to fear. But something else, too, something darker. This was not the forest she knew. This was the true heart of the land, the roots of its hunger. The whispers, no longer soft but loud like the voices of the dead, all began to chant again, rising in unison, repeating the same words over and over. "Join us. Join us." Sarah reached for John, her hand trembling as she moved toward him. But before she could touch him, the ground beneath them trembled. A cracking sound filled the air, so sharp that it felt like it was cutting through her very soul. She looked down at her feet and saw the earth splitting, the pit widening further, stretching its hungry edges out toward her. She stepped back in shock, but the ground continued to tremble. Roots shot up from the abyss, thick and grotesque, reaching toward her with rapid, jerking movements like serpents hungry for flesh. "No," Sarah screamed, her voice raw with terror. "No, I won't go down there." But it was too late. The roots pulled her feet out from under her, yanking her down, dragging her toward the abyss. Sarah kicked and clawed at the ground, but the forest was stronger than she was, its pull relentless, suffocating. John's face flickered in the distance, his form wavering between reality and nothingness. "Don't let it take you." His voice was soft, so soft, as though it were coming from far away, but Sarah was beyond saving. As the roots closed around her, pulling her down into the darkness, she knew there was no escape. No one could hear her screams. The forest had claimed her, just as it had claimed so many before her. And as the shadows swallowed her whole, the last thing Sarah felt was the cold, pressing weight of the forest's heart. The darkness was suffocating. For an eternity, or perhaps only an instant, Sarah's mind drifted in and out of consciousness, as if she were floating in some liminal space between the world she had known and the world she now belonged to. The pull of the abyss had not loosened its grip. The roots, thick and gnarled, twisted around her, not letting her go, dragging her deeper into the earth's core, into the heart of the forest. The world above her had disappeared, swallowed whole by the forest's insatiable hunger. But as the cold, oppressive darkness pressed in on her, she felt something change, a subtle shift, a faint stirring in the air. It was as though a memory was returning to her, a memory that had been buried beneath layers of time and pain, waiting to resurface. Her eyes flickered open, but it wasn't the same as before. The pit had closed, and in its place was a strange, half-formed world, a shadowed reflection of the place she had once walked. The trees around her were twisted, deformed, skeletal, with bark that seemed to bleed shadows rather than sap. The mist, thick as ever, clung to her like a second skin, smothering her with the scent of rot and dampness. The air was still, silent. Even the wind seemed to be held captive by the forest's will. As Sarah's senses returned to her, she became acutely aware of the pressure against her chest, her heart beating faster with each breath she took. And then a new sound reached her ears. The whispers. At first they were faint, like the wind rustling through the leaves, soft and distant. But as she listened, the whispers grew louder, more urgent. The voices were angry now, frantic, as if something was stirring beneath the earth, a presence that was both ancient and terrifying. She's awake, at last. The words were garbled, overlapping, tumbling over each other in an incoherent chorus. But Sarah could feel them vibrating in her bones, each syllable sinking deeper into her consciousness, twisting her thoughts, her very sense of self. Her body felt strange, heavy, but also distant. She reached up, her hands trembling as she tried to push herself off the ground. The roots loosened their hold on her, but only by a fraction. Just enough to allow her to move, but not enough to free her entirely. She wasn't alone anymore. There were others with her, hidden in the shadows, their forms barely visible through the thick mist. She turned her head sharply and saw them, figures drifting between the trees. They were the forgotten ones, the lost, the souls who had come before her. Their bodies were thin, gaunt, their faces pale and expressionless. Their eyes were empty, hollow sockets that burned with the faintest, dimmest glow, like embers long extinguished. They drifted aimlessly, their movements slow, as though they were bound to this place, trapped in the same eternal loop of suffering. They're not dead, a voice whispered in her ear, sharp, cutting through the fog of her thoughts. Not yet. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She knew this voice. It was his voice, the same one she had heard before, the one she thought had been swallowed by the forest. John. They're not dead. Not truly. His voice was strained, desperate. They're lost, like you. The realization struck her like a cold slap to the face. These were the souls of the forest, those who had fallen victim to its curse, those who had wandered too far, too deep. They had become part of the forest, bound to it, their bodies slowly decaying, their minds fading, their existence reduced to a hollow echo. Her legs felt like lead as she tried to rise, but the roots around her tightened again, pulling her back down. The forgotten ones moved closer, their hollow eyes turning toward her, their heads tilting in unison, as if they had recognized her, as if they knew what she had become. You will join us, one of them rasped, the voice cracked and broken. You have no choice. No, Sarah whispered, her throat dry, the word barely escaping her lips. I don't belong here. I won't. But the roots tightened their grip, forcing her back down. The mist thickened, swirling around her feet, pulling her deeper into the ground. The whispers became louder, filling her head with 1,000 frantic voices, all demanding her attention. The forgotten ones closed in, their eyes burning with that same empty glow, their lips parted in a grotesque imitation of a smile. She's the one, another voice murmured. The one who's been chosen. Chosen? Sarah's voice trembled, her pulse quickening with panic. Chosen for what? The air seemed to grow colder as the forgotten ones took another step closer, their shapes becoming more defined, more solid. She could see the scars on their faces, the marks of their suffering. The forest had taken everything from them, just as it had taken from her. But they weren't gone, not completely. They were still there, lingering in the half-life of this cursed realm, still bound. And in that moment, Sarah understood. The forest had always been alive. It had always hungered. The root system was more than just a network of trees. It was a living entity, an ancient god, bound to the land itself. And it fed. It fed on the lost, on the broken, on those who wandered too far into its depths, too deep into its ancient hollow heart. And it never let go. The forgotten ones were its vessel, its connection, its offering. They were the ones who had forgotten who they were, their names, their histories, just as Sarah was beginning to forget hers. They had become the forest's servants, its extensions. And now she too was becoming one of them. Her hands shook as she reached toward her chest, feeling the cool, damp air brush against her skin. There, on the surface of her skin, faint and flickering like dying embers, were symbols. Symbols that weren't there before. They twisted and writhed, glowing, faintly in the dark, a living language she could not understand. The forest's mark. The whispers reached a fever pitch. "You will join us," the forgotten ones chanted, their voices rising in eerie unison. "You will be one with us, and the forest will never let you go." Her eyes locked onto John's face, one last time, and she saw it. The truth in his expression, the sorrow, the regret. He had been one of them. He had been chosen. And now, she too would become part of the forest's hunger. And as the roots finally began to consume her, wrapping her in their cold, unyielding embrace, she heard John's voice one last time. "It's not over, Sarah. It's never over." Thume? Darkness closed in around her, but it wasn't the end. No, it was only the beginning. The mist was thick now, an impenetrable blanket of fog that crawled over the earth like a living thing. It clung to her skin, to her lungs, seeping into her veins, as if the very air were poisoned. Sarah could barely move, the weight of the roots pressing down on her, pinning her to the cold earth. Her limbs felt heavy, alien, like they no longer belonged to her. The forest had taken her, but she was still aware. Still, her. In the distance, she could hear the faint, hollow murmurs of the forgotten ones, their voices rising in eerie unison, chanting words she could no longer understand. They were calling to her, beckoning her into the fold of the forest's dark, ever-hungry embrace. And as the cold earth swallowed her whole, she felt her mind begin to slip, like the forest's roots were tangling with her very thoughts, unraveling them, twisting them until she couldn't tell where she ended and the forest began. It was then that she understood the true nature of the forest. It didn't just consume, it rewrote, it erased, and it didn't matter who you were, how you had come to be here. Once the forest had you, you belonged to it. There was no escaping it, no way to outrun its hunger. Sarah's chest heaved with a final, desperate breath, her heart pounding against the weight of the earth, her body fighting to remain human. But as she exhaled, her breath turned cold in the air. The symbols on her skin, those twisting, glowing marks, pulsed beneath her fingers, like the beating of her own heart, like the pulse of the forest itself. The roots tightened their grip, sinking deeper into her flesh, until the pain became something distant, something she could no longer focus on. Her mind was fading, and yet through the disorienting haze she heard it. A voice, a whisper. It wasn't John. Not now. It was something else, someone else, you're still here. The voice was soft, almost comforting, but there was a strange undercurrent to it, an edge that sent a chill down her spine. She forced her eyes open, blinking against the fog, and for a moment she thought she saw a figure standing before her, shrouded in the mist. The shape was indistinct, like a shadow bleeding into the fog, but the voice was unmistakable. The figure took a step closer, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. It was her, the woman who had led her to this point, the woman who had told her the stories, the ancient whispered tales of the forest's hunger. She was standing there, her face pale and drawn, her eyes dark and hollow. Her lips curled into a thin, knowing smile, as though she had been waiting for Sarah all along. "You didn't listen, did you?" the woman said softly. "You didn't listen when you should have. Now you belong to the forest, like the others." Sarah opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came. Her voice was gone, sucked away by the forest's unyielding embrace. The woman stepped forward, kneeling beside her, the mist swirling around her like a cloak. She reached out a hand, her fingers cool and dry as they brushed against Sarah's. "Cheek, it's not over," the woman said, her eyes locking onto Sarah's. "The forest always gets what it wants. In the end, it takes everything, even your memory." Sarah's vision blurred, her body trembling as the roots squeezed tighter, cutting off the last vestiges of her strength. She felt the earth shifting beneath her, the weight of it pressing into her bones, her very soul. The woman leaned closer, her breath a cold whisper against Sarah's ear. "But it's not just you who's lost. It's all of us, all the ones the forest has taken. We live on in the dark, in the roots, in the forgotten corners of this place, and so will you, forever. You'll become one of the hollow ones, one of the voices in the mist." As the last of Sarah's strength faded, the woman stood up, her form dissolving into the fog, her voice trailing off like the last echo of a dream. "You'll never be alone here." Not really. The ground beneath Sarah's body began to shift, as though the earth was folding in on itself. The roots had taken her fully now, sinking deep into her flesh, and as they did, her mind began to slip away, like a dream that faded. As soon as you tried to grasp it, the pain, the fear, the loss, they all became distant memories, fragments of a past life she could no longer recall. Her name was slipping from her grasp. She was losing herself. But as the forest's grip deepened, she felt something strange, something far darker than mere fear. A voice, one she had never heard before, but one that felt as old as the earth itself, whispered in her ear. "You are the forest now. You are one with us." The mist rose around her in a swirling, choking cloud, and the forgotten ones gathered close, their hollow eyes glowing with a strange, familiar light. They were no longer figures of pity, of loss. They were the forest, the roots, the earth, the hunger, and now Sarah was one of them. The last shred of her consciousness blinked out, leaving behind only the hollow echo of her name, now lost forever in the dark, twisted labyrinth of the forest's heart. And so, the forest claims another soul. But the stories remain whispered in the wind, in the rustling of the leaves, in the hollow, empty places that were once home. And somewhere in the deep, lost within the roots, Sarah waits. She is the forest now, and she will never, ever be alone. You're deep into the story now, and the horrors are only escalating. If you're still with us, don't forget to like and subscribe. Tell us where you're listening from in the comments. Who else is staying up late to face this nightmare? Settle in. The terror continues. Story 2. The shiver of beginnings. The sun hadn't quite risen over the Great Smoky Mountains, but the air was already thick with the warmth of the day to come. The mist that clung to the forest floor curled upward in wisps, as though it, too, were reluctant to leave the cool of the night. The hikers, 5 of them in all, stood at the trailhead, their boots crunching against the gravel as they adjusted their packs and checked the maps one last time. They had been planning this trip for weeks, a weekend in the wilderness, away from the pressures of life. No cell service, no emails, no constant buzzing of notifications. Just them, the forest, and the quiet expanse of Tennessee's natural beauty. But the forest, with its towering pines and sweeping oaks, was far more than it appeared. Something ancient stirred in its depths, something not easily found on a map. Nathan, the leader of the group, was the first to speak. He had been to the Smokies before, though never on this particular trail. He pointed ahead to the path, well worn and familiar, stretching deep into the mountains. "We stick to the main trail today. No detours," he warned, the sound of his voice too sharp in the otherwise tranquil morning air. He was a seasoned outdoorsman, and it showed in the way he moved with purpose, his every step deliberate and confident. Emma, always eager to push the boundaries of adventure, frowned at the caution in his voice. She was the type to get lost in a book about the unexplained, to lose herself in old folklore and strange mysteries. She had always believed the stories about the mountains, stories of things lost to time, of spirits trapped in the fog, of trails that led nowhere and back again. "I'm not so sure about that," she said, her voice teasing but full of curiosity. "What's the fun in sticking to the safe path?" She glanced over to Mark and Jenna, the other two in the group, both of whom were less interested in exploring the supernatural side of the woods. Mark, ever the skeptic, simply shrugged. "Yeah, sure. Let's stick to the route," he said with a chuckle. "We'll see the sights, get some great photos, and be back to the car by sundown." But Emma wasn't listening. Her eyes had already drifted to the narrow trail that forked off to the side. It wasn't on any of their maps, and the faint markings of worn-out boots told her it had been traveled before. The trees on either side seemed to bow inward, their branches twisting into strange, almost unnatural shapes, casting long shadows that stretched across the path. "I say we check it out," Emma said, her voice lowering, as though whispering a secret to the forest. "Who knows? We might find something interesting." There was a glint in her eyes that neither Nathan nor Mark could ignore. They exchanged a quick glance. "You mean dangerous," Mark muttered, shaking his head. "If it's not on the map, there's a reason for that." But Nathan, the ever-pragmatic leader, hesitated. He studied the fork, his brow furrowing in thought. The path was enticing, pulling at the edges of his consciousness. It called to him in a way that was almost too compelling. "All right," he said finally, after a beat of silence, "but just for a little while. We stay close, and if anything feels off, we head back. Agreed?" Emma's face lit up with that familiar sense of mischievous excitement. Mark rolled his eyes but shrugged again, already adjusting his pack as he set off down the fork, his boots crunching against the brittle leaves. Jenna followed, muttering something about not getting lost. The forest quickly enveloped them, the wide trail soon becoming narrow and twisted. The air was thick with the scent of damp moss and the earthy perfume of fallen leaves, their colors just beginning to change for the season. The silence was oppressive. No birds sang overhead, and the faint rustling of wind in the trees had stopped completely. The world seemed to hold its breath. Jenna was the first to notice it. "It's eerily quiet, isn't it?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. Nathan nodded, but his eyes were scanning the surroundings, as though expecting something to leap out from the underbrush. The silence had settled deep, like the forest was holding something back, keeping it locked away. "Yeah," Mark added, his voice carrying a hint of unease that he tried to suppress. "But we're deep in the woods now. It'll be quieter the farther we go." But Emma was already several paces ahead, her gaze fixed on something beyond the trees. It was almost as though she could feel the weight of something watching her, something unseen, but ever present. She reached out for the bark of a nearby tree, brushing her fingers along the rough surface, when a sudden noise shattered the stillness. A sharp crack echoed in the distance, followed by the sound of something heavy moving through the underbrush. Emma's breath caught in her throat. Her first instinct was to pull away from the tree, but she hesitated. There was something odd about the sound. It wasn't an animal, not like any creature she had heard in the woods before. "Did you hear that?" she asked, turning back to the group. They had stopped several paces behind her, waiting for her to move. Nathan stepped forward. His face, usually composed and confident, now carried a subtle tension. "Probably just a deer or something," he said, though the uncertainty in his voice betrayed him. But Emma didn't believe that. The sound had been too distinct, and whatever it was, it felt closer now, creeping along the edges of their senses, like a shadow. They continued onward, the path growing steadily more narrow as they pressed deeper into the woods. The trees began to thicken, their trunks twisted and gnarled, limbs reaching out like skeletal fingers. And yet, despite the oppressive quiet, something else began to settle over them, a sense of being watched. They rounded a bend in the trail, and it was there that they saw it, a half-built wooden bridge spanning a small creek. The planks were uneven, hastily nailed together. Some were crooked, others cracked. The bridge seemed to be unfinished, as though someone had started the project and then simply left it behind. There was no sign of anyone nearby, no evidence of recent work. Jenna hesitated at the edge of the creek. "This doesn't feel right," she murmured, glancing back toward the others. But it was Emma who moved first, stepping onto the bridge, her boots creaking as the wood groaned under her weight. "It's fine," Emma said with a grin. "The bridge looks old, but it's stable enough. Let's keep going." They crossed the creek, the sound of the water rushing below the bridge, oddly muffled, as though the mountain itself was dampening their senses. Emma was the first to reach the other side, but as she looked back, she noticed something strange. The trees behind them had grown denser, the shadows deeper. It was as if the forest was closing in, drawing them further away from the world they knew. It was then that they saw it, a signpost wedged into the earth. It stood just off the trail, half hidden by a tangle of ivy. The words carved into the wood were faint but legible. "Trail under construction." The letters were uneven, as though hastily carved. But what struck Emma most was the date. Etched beside the words was the year 2004. The group gathered around the signpost, exchanging glances. The year seemed odd. It was far too long ago for any construction work to still be ongoing. Yet no, one had mentioned this unfinished trail in the guidebooks or maps they had consulted. The sensation of something off grew stronger, more oppressive. "All right, that's it," Nathan said firmly, his voice pulling them back from their unease. "We need to turn around and head back. This isn't a trail, it's leading us somewhere. We don't want to go." But Emma was already staring at something beyond the signpost, her heart beating faster as her eyes locked onto the object that had caught her attention. A backpack resting on a nearby rock. A simple, nondescript pack, but full of supplies. A bottle of water, a bag of trail mix, a map that was rolled up inside, and yet it was covered in dust, untouched by any recent rain. It looked as though it had been there for months, perhaps longer. "Who left this here?" Mark asked, stepping closer to the pack, his voice rising with the question. "I don't know," Emma whispered, her fingers brushing over the straps. "But it wasn't any of us." As they debated whether to continue forward or turn back, the feeling of being watched grew stronger, more pressing. The quiet, that terrible, suffocating silence, seemed to stretch even further, wrapping around them like a net. Something in the woods wanted them to stay. And then, just when they thought they had made up their minds, they saw it. A new signpost ahead. Freshly carved wood, standing taller than the others. It was planted firmly in the earth, gleaming in the dimming light of the afternoon. The words carved into the wood were simple. "Stay." The depths of silence. The word "stay" seemed to echo in the quiet air, lingering in their minds longer than it should have. Each of them felt the weight of it, but none spoke it aloud, as if saying the word would make it real in some deeper way. Emma, her fingers still brushing the edges of the abandoned backpack, felt a strange pulse in her chest, like a subtle tremor that quickened with each passing second. She turned to the others, her eyes wide, her voice barely a whisper. That doesn't make sense. Nathan, his brow furrowed deeply, stepped forward cautiously, his boots crunching against the dry leaves. It doesn't, but it's there, he said, his voice low and hesitant. He reached out and touched the wooden signpost, his hand lingering on the rough surface. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had been left for them, something they couldn't ignore. Yet there was a sinking feeling in his stomach, a primal instinct that urged him to leave. Maybe it's just a prank, Mark offered, though his voice betrayed him, a nervous edge creeping in. He was clearly uneasy now, the skeptical air about him growing thin. A bunch of kids messing around out here. Or maybe someone else got lost, Jenna added, glancing around, her eyes darting nervously, as if expecting someone to appear from the shadows of the trees. But Emma shook her head. Her eyes were fixed on the signpost, and the word "stay" seemed to pulse with a strange energy. She couldn't explain it, but she felt a tug deep in her gut, an inexplicable pull toward whatever lay beyond. There was something about this place, about the forest, that felt off-kilter, like the laws of nature themselves had bent out of shape. Why would someone carve it so freshly, she asked, her voice trembling with the first real inkling of fear. This isn't just a sign. It feels like a warning. Nathan straightened up, casting a quick glance around at the others. Let's not overthink this. It's probably just an old trail marker. We turn around now, head back to the main path, and call it a day. Emma wanted to argue, but the strange quiet kept her grounded, her feet planted firmly on the earth as though the forest itself were holding her there. The air, once rich with the scent of pine and damp earth, had become stifling, almost suffocating. Her throat felt tight, her chest heavy, as if the weight of the trees above were pressing down on her, and beneath all of that, a buzzing, a hum, a sound just on the edge of hearing, was growing steadily louder, as if the forest itself were waking up. Jenna took a step back, looking over her shoulder. I don't like it. I want to go back now. But it wasn't just Jenna. Emma noticed the others shifting uneasily, the reluctance creeping in their movements, as if their bodies were responding to some deep instinct they couldn't fully comprehend. Nathan, feeling the tension building between them, took one last glance at the signpost before turning to lead them back down the narrow path. But as he stepped forward, a strange sound like the rustling of leaves filled the air. No one had moved. No breeze had stirred. The sound grew louder, closer. They froze. Then suddenly the bushes ahead parted, and a figure emerged from the trees. It was a man, ragged, thin, with deep shadows under his eyes. His clothes were tattered and stained, his face gaunt, as if he hadn't seen the sun in years. He stood still, staring at them, his gaze unnervingly intense. For a long, uncomfortable moment, none of them spoke. The man said nothing. He didn't even move, simply watched them as if waiting for something. The forest, if it were even possible, grew even quieter. Who are you? Nathan's voice cracked as he stepped forward, his protective instincts kicking in. The man didn't respond, just continued to stare at him, unblinking. The silence stretched on, the air thickening with every passing second. It felt like something was building, something just beyond the edge of their understanding. Emma's skin prickled, her heart pounding louder in her ears. The buzzing in her head had become almost deafening, drowning out everything else. And then, without a word, the man took a step back into the trees, disappearing as quickly as he had appeared. Wait, Nathan called, his feet following before he could stop himself. Who? But it was too late. The man was gone, vanished into the dense foliage as if he had never existed. They stood there in stunned silence, staring at the spot where he had been, as if expecting him to reappear. But he didn't. What the hell was that? Mark's voice finally broke through the thick quiet, his tone a mixture of disbelief and growing fear. I don't know, Nathan replied, his mind racing. But we're not alone out here. That much is clear. They stood, there still, all of them feeling the same deep unease settle over them, like a dark cloud they couldn't shake. The woods, which had felt so still and quiet before, now seemed to hum with a palpable tension. The oppressive silence had returned, but it felt different now, more profound, more suffocating. Emma turned toward the others, her voice shaking. We need to go back. We're not meant to be here. Her words were met with a chorus of uneasy nods, and without another word, they began to retrace their steps down the path. The deeper they went into the forest, the heavier the air became, and with each step, the sense of unease grew stronger. Yet, it wasn't until they reached the spot where the strange man had appeared that they realized something terrifying, something they hadn't noticed before. The backpack, the one they had found earlier, was gone. The rock where it had rested was empty, the moss and dirt undisturbed as though it had never been there. The realization hit them all at once. They were not alone, and worse still, the forest knew them. It was watching them. Nathan stopped abruptly, the others bumping into him as they tried to keep up. We need to get out of here, now. The urgency in his voice was clear, but the path in front of them no longer looked familiar. The trees, once distant, now crowded the trail, twisting and contorting in ways they shouldn't have. The path ahead seemed to narrow, the edges of the woods closing in. Then, just as they began to move forward, they heard it again. The rustling, not from the trees, but from somewhere close. Right behind them, whispers, faint at first, then louder. Stay. The word echoed through the trees, but this time it wasn't from the signpost. It was all around them. Stay, stay, stay. A slow chill crept up their spines, the voices seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It felt like the forest was alive, breathing with them, following their every step. Their footsteps faltered as the eerie, persistent whisper continued to grow louder. The last of the light from the setting sun began to fade, the woods around them sinking into a deeper, heavier shadow. And with that, they realized they weren't just lost. The forest had claimed them. The path that doesn't end. The whispering continued, its insistent hum vibrating through the ground, seeping into their bones. It was a soft, almost tender sound, like a lullaby sung in the darkest corners of the world. But there was nothing comforting about it. It felt invasive, as though something ancient, long buried beneath the roots and rocks of the mountain, was clawing its way to the surface. Nathan's breath came faster now, his heart pounding in his chest. He gripped his flashlight tighter, its beam trembling in his hand, casting long, twitching shadows across the underbrush. We need to get back to the main trail, he repeated, more to himself than to the others. His voice was sharp, and it cracked with the tension rising inside him. But the others couldn't take their eyes off the trees. Emma, her pulse racing, glanced behind her, her skin crawling at the thought of whatever, or whoever, was following them. The darkness seemed to pool around them like a tide, suffocating everything it touched. The path, once clear, had begun to twist and bend unnaturally, narrowing as though the forest itself were reshaping to trap them. Should we call for help? Jenna asked, her voice small and uncertain. We've got a signal. Maybe we can just... But before she could finish, the trees in front of them shifted. It was subtle at first, branches swaying as if moved by an unseen hand. The leaves rustled, but there was no wind to explain it. The air, already heavy with dread, thickened, pressing in on them from every direction. Mark swallowed, his mouth dry. This is bad. This feels wrong. Nathan turned back, his mind racing as he tried to piece together the growing nightmare. He could feel it now, the creeping sensation, like eyes watching from every shadow. The whispering seemed to grow, louder as the forest closed in, but the words were no longer soft. They were sharp, jagged, each repetition digging deeper into his mind. Stay, stay, stay. He gritted his teeth and turned back to face the path ahead, determined to push forward, but when he looked ahead, his stomach dropped. The path was gone. In its place was a thick wall of trees, their trunks blackened and twisted, their branches clawing into the sky like fingers of the damned. The forest had changed. No longer a place of wilderness, but something far darker, something that had swallowed the trail and everything in its wake. Where's the trail? Emma's voice was thin, trembling. She stepped forward, only to be met with the oppressive barrier of the dark trees. They were closing in from all sides now, the once innocent woods turning hostile. Nathan's mind raced. They had to have missed something. The path hadn't simply disappeared. He spun around, his flashlight sweeping the trees in a frantic arc, but there was no sign of the trail, no sign of any other way out. It was as though the forest itself had swallowed it. He turned back to the group, trying to steady his breathing. Okay, listen, we need to stay calm. Let's backtrack. We must have taken a wrong turn. If we keep moving in the same direction, we'll find our way out. But his words seemed hollow even to him. There was no wrong turn. The forest wasn't just dense, it was alive, and it was closing in on them. No matter how much he wanted to believe otherwise, something deep within him whispered that they were no longer in control. Look, Mark said suddenly, his voice low and hushed. He pointed to the side, where something strange caught the beam of Nathan's flashlight. It was another signpost, barely visible through the trees, its wood weathered and cracked. Nathan's heart skipped a beat. The words on it were different this time. These were not carved, but scrawled in crude, jagged letters that appeared almost hastily written. Turn back. Jesus, Jenna whispered, stepping back. This is insane. Emma stepped forward, her curiosity outweighing her fear. She reached out, touching the rough surface of the sign. The wood was damp, slick with something that wasn't just water. It was as though the forest itself had bled into it. Someone else was here, Emma murmured, her voice trembling as her fingers traced the crude letters. But when? Nathan swallowed hard. We don't know what's going on here, but we need to stay focused. This is some kind of prank, or maybe some kind of... The air shifted again, a strange pressure building as the words he was about to say caught in his throat. The whispering had stopped, and the silence that followed was deafening. It was an emptiness that gnawed at the edges of their sanity, a stillness so deep it felt unnatural. And then, from the darkness ahead, there came a sound, a slow, deliberate scraping, like nails on a chalkboard. They all froze, the hairs on the back of their necks standing at attention. The sound wasn't from the trees, wasn't from the earth. Beneath their feet, it was something more personal, something closer. It came from within the woods themselves, a sound that seemed to vibrate with an otherworldly resonance. The scraping stopped. Then, without warning, the forest exploded into a cacophony of sound. It was as if the trees were alive, groaning, creaking, shifting. The earth trembled beneath their feet, sending vibrations up their legs. And then, from the shadows, a figure appeared. It was tall, too tall, its body skeletal and ragged, draped in what looked like a tattered cloak of moss and vines. Its face was obscured by a black hood, but the shape of it was unmistakable, long and twisted, with eyes that gleamed like dark coals. The figure moved slowly, but the ground around it seemed to crackle with energy, as though the very earth was bending to its will. Emma gasped, stumbling backward, her heart hammering in her, chest. The others took a step back too, the fear in their eyes undeniable, but none of them could move. The figure raised one hand slowly, its bony fingers stretching out toward them. It wasn't just a figure, it was an entity, something that didn't belong to this world, something that had found a home in the trees, in the shadows, in the silence. The air grew colder, and with each passing second the figure drew nearer, its presence filling the space like a crushing weight. Then, with a voice that scraped like gravel, the figure spoke, the words slow and deliberate. "Stay." The word was a command, not a plea. It wasn't a warning, it was an invitation. The figure's head tilted slightly, as though it were observing them, waiting. Emma felt her legs grow weak, her body trembling with a mixture of terror and something else, something darker, more primal, like an ancient urge to kneel, to surrender. But then, in an instant, the figure stepped forward, its hand still outstretched, and everything went dark. The heart of the forest. The darkness swallowed them whole, and for a moment they were adrift in a void where even time seemed to stand still. Emma couldn't feel the ground beneath her feet anymore. Her senses were disoriented, drowning in the oppressive blackness. It was as if the forest itself had pulled the light from the world, and they were suspended in an endless night. Then, as quickly as it had come, the darkness receded, and with it came a strange, piercing silence. A silence so absolute, so complete, that it seemed unnatural, as though even sound itself had been forced to obey some invisible law. Emma blinked, trying to adjust to the sudden dim light. They were no longer in the same place. The trees had changed. Where the twisted, gnarled trunks had once reached out like clawed hands, now there were smooth, pale white trunks, like bone, their bark marked with strange, arcane symbols that seemed to shift under her gaze. The ground beneath their feet was no longer the soft, leaf-littered earth, but cold stone, slick with moisture. Everything around them had a damp, earthy smell, but it was mixed with something sharper, something metallic. Emma's breath caught in her throat. The air was thicker now, as though it were dense with something unseen, an oppressive weight that made every breath feel like a struggle. The trees rose higher now, impossibly so, their tops disappearing into an infinite sky that looked more like the underside of an ancient crumbling temple ceiling than a natural sky. The starlight above them had a sickly greenish hue, casting a strange, unearthly glow over the landscape. Nathan's voice broke the silence, but even he sounded distant, as if speaking through water. "Where are we?" Mark took a step forward, his eyes scanning the strange new surroundings. This isn't the same forest. This doesn't look like the Smoky Mountains anymore." "No kidding," Jenna muttered, her voice tight. She looked over her shoulder nervously, as if expecting something to emerge from the trees behind them. "This place feels wrong, like we're not supposed to be here." Emma's heart was pounding now, the realization dawning that this was no longer just an abandoned trail or a mysterious, unmarked path. They weren't lost. They were somewhere else. She spun around, her eyes searching for the signpost they had seen earlier, the one that had warned them to stay. But it was gone. Its place was another signpost, but this one was different. It was carved from blackened wood, and the symbols on it were unfamiliar, twisting runes that seemed to shift and change, their meanings ever eluding her. The sign read, "Surrender." Emma's stomach turned. The word felt like a weight around her chest, pressing down on her lungs. There was no mistaking it. This was a place that demanded something from them, something they weren't prepared to give. The scraping sound returned, faint at first, like a distant whisper in the wind. It wasn't a breeze that moved the trees, it was something else, something deliberate. Did you hear that? Nathan's voice was strained. Before anyone could answer, the trees ahead of them shifted, as if something large was moving between them, blocking their path. A shape emerged from the shadows, a massive, hulking form covered in what looked like layers of vines and moss, its body twisting unnaturally as it moved. It was too dark to make out the details, but the sheer size of it made Emma's blood run cold. Is that it?" Mark whispered, his eyes wide with terror. "That thing. That was in the forest with us, the one who told us to stay," Jenna whispered, her voice trembling. Her hand reached for her pack, but she didn't seem to know what she was hoping to find there. The creature, if it could be called that, slowly stepped into the clearing, its presence overwhelming. It wasn't just its size that was terrifying, though that was bad enough. It was the way it moved, its limbs not bending in a natural way, but jerking, twitching, as though the bones inside its body were broken only to be held together by some unseen force. Its face was hidden beneath a tangled mass of vines, but Emma could see the shape of its eyes beneath the leaves, tiny, gleaming pinpricks of light that seemed to see them even in the gloom. Its head tilted, and it emitted a low, vibrating hum. It wasn't a sound that could be described as a growl or a roar. It was something deeper, something that reverberated in the very air around them, a sound that chilled the marrow in their bones. "Stay," the creature rasped, its voice crackling like dry leaves in a fire. It didn't say anything else, just that one word drawn out with a strange, almost hypnotic cadence. Emma felt the pull again, the same invisible tug she had felt when they had first seen the sign. The word "stay" echoed in her mind, louder now, twisting with a strange kind of urgency. It was almost as if the forest itself were inviting them to remain, to accept whatever strange force had created this twisted, ancient place. But something deep inside Emma told her this was no longer about curiosity. This wasn't an adventure or an unexplored trail, it was a trap. "Move!" Nathan shouted, suddenly snapping out of the trance-like daze the creature's presence had put them in. He grabbed Emma's wrist and yanked her backward, pulling her away from the beast. The others followed, fear propelling them forward, but they didn't get far. The ground beneath their feet began to tremble, sending vibrations through their legs. The trees shifted again, this time moving toward them, as if they were being herded by the forest itself. The creatures, more than one now, stepped forward, their dark forms emerging from the shadows between the trees. They weren't alone. There were others, a dozen or more, each one more grotesque than the last, their bodies distorted and broken in ways that defied logic, their eyes gleaming in the darkness like hungry stars. The forest was alive with them. It was no longer just a place. It was a living, breathing entity that thrived on fear, on despair. And then, as if to emphasize their doom, the sky above them began to crack open. Not with lightning, but with something darker, an inky blackness that bled into the sky, spilling like ink across the stars. The air grew colder, the forest darker, and the creatures that surrounded them moved closer, closer, their steps slow, deliberate, as if savoring the moment. Emma's heart raced in her chest. She knew they had no way out, no way to fight this. The pull to stay was growing stronger, like a magnetic force tugging at the deepest parts of her soul. She could feel the others around her, their terror palpable. But she couldn't take her. Eyes off the figure at the center, the massive creature who had first told them to stay, and it spoke again, its voice filling their minds as much as their ears. "Stay, and you will belong." Emma's throat tightened. She knew what it meant. This wasn't just about surviving. This wasn't about escaping. It was about becoming part of this place, about succumbing to the forest's will. The question now was whether they could resist. The price of silence. The creatures closed in. their eyes fixed on the group with an unblinking intensity. Emma's legs felt like lead, each step becoming harder, as if the ground beneath her was pulling her downward. The air around her thickened, pressing against her chest, making each breath feel like it could be her last. The massive creature, the one that had first spoken, took a slow step forward, its body swaying unnaturally with every movement. Its hollow, vine-covered face tilted in their direction, as though studying them with some ancient and terrible knowledge. The other creatures, smaller, but no less grotesque, began to circle them, forming a tight ring, blocking any path of escape. Nathan's grip on Emma's wrist tightened, and she could feel the tremble in his hands. His voice came out in a hoarse whisper. "We need to fight. We can't just give in." But his words were hollow, just as the ones they had heard from the creatures. Emma could feel the heavy pull to stay, to accept the invitation that had been thrust upon them. The urge was overwhelming now, so strong that it almost drowned out the terror, almost made her believe that surrendering wasn't such a terrible choice after all. "No," she whispered, shaking her head, trying to break free from the magnetic force of the forest. "No, we can't stay." But the forest was already pressing in on them. It was as if the very earth beneath their feet was shifting, its intentions as ancient as time itself. The trees creaked with a life of their own, their branches reaching down like skeletal hands, desperate to draw them in, to take them. The creatures didn't move any closer, but their presence grew stronger, more suffocating. The stillness of the forest pressed in on all sides, making Emma feel smaller, more insignificant, as if the very space around her were closing in on her. Her thoughts felt clouded, fogged by the unnatural weight of the place, and she fought to hold on to clarity, to resist the pull. "We need to find a way out," Mark said, his voice barely audible, but his words filled with a desperate urgency. He took a tentative step back, his eyes darting around for any possible escape. But there was nothing. Just the circle of creatures, the unblinking eyes, and the towering trees that seemed to close off every path. I don't know what's happening," Jenna whispered, her voice breaking. "But it's like we're trapped in a dream. I can't think straight. It's like I'm..." She stopped, eyes wide with horror. "Like I'm forgetting things." The words hit Emma like a slap. Forgetting things, that was it. Something was erasing them, erasing their memories, their will, their very identity. The forest wasn't just alive, it was hungry for their essence, for their minds, their souls. It didn't just want them to stay, it wanted them to become part of it, to be swallowed by it, consumed by its timeless hunger. She looked around at the others, seeing their confusion, their fear, their loss of control. They were all starting to feel it. The subtle shift, the way their thoughts were becoming cloudy, the way they were no longer sure what was real and what was illusion. Emma's head spun. "We can't let it take us. We can't." Her voice trembled. "We have to hold on to who we are, to what we are." But the creatures were not listening. They weren't concerned with their pleas, their resistance. They were simply watching, waiting. And then, with an almost imperceptible movement, the creature at the center, its form towering and shifting in the dim light, took a step forward. The forest seemed to ripple with its motion. A strange sound, like the rustling of dead leaves, filled the air. The voice came again. This time, it was not just a whisper. It was a command, a demand. "Surrender." And with those words, everything shifted. The ground beneath their feet trembled violently. The creatures flinched, their bodies twitching, as if responding to some unseen signal. The trees around them groaned, their branches cracking, as if the entire forest was coming alive, stretching and moving in ways that defied logic. The pull was stronger now. Emma felt herself drawn in by an invisible force. Her heart thudded in her chest as her mind struggled to hold on, to push back against the creeping sensation of losing herself. Suddenly there was a flash of light, a fleeting image in the distance, a figure standing just beyond the ring of creatures watching them. For a moment Emma thought she imagined it, but then the figure stepped forward and she knew it was not a hallucination. It was a person. A woman, tall and graceful, with hair like silver strands of moonlight. Her face was serene, almost peaceful, but her eyes, they were dark, black like the void itself, and they gleamed with an unsettling ancient knowledge. She wore a cloak of mist and leaves flowing around her like smoke. She moved between the creatures, undisturbed by their presence, as though she belonged here, as if she were part of this dark and twisted world. She didn't look at the others, but her gaze settled on Emma. A strange warmth washed over Emma, as if the woman's presence was familiar, as if she had known her for a lifetime, even though she couldn't place her. The woman spoke softly, her voice calm, yet carrying the weight of centuries. "You need not resist, child. This place is not cruel, only misunderstood. You are meant to stay. You are part of it now." "No," Emma whispered, shaking her head, her mind screaming in defiance. "No, I'm not part of this. I won't stay." The woman tilted her head, her black eyes softening just for a moment. "You are already here. You have already given yourself to it." Emma's heart slammed against her ribs, the words sinking into her very soul. It wasn't just the pull of the forest that was working against them. It was their own memories, their own will that was being erased, rewritten. "You have nothing left to fight, child," the woman said, her voice soothing, almost like a lullaby. "Let go. Let it take you." A sudden surge of energy tore through Emma. It was like an invisible force slamming into her, forcing her to her knees. The woman's figure blurred, and Emma felt the edges of her consciousness begin to slip away. The fog was closing in, and with it, all that she had ever known. The friends around her, the memories of her life, herself, were being slowly erased. Just as she thought she would be swallowed by the darkness, the image of the woman faded, and Emma heard a voice, a familiar, desperate voice, cut through the silence. "Nathan." It was Mark's voice, raw with panic. "Nathan, help her!" But it was too late. Emma's vision blurred, the faces of her friends becoming distant, unfocused. She felt the weight of the forest's gaze upon her, and for the first time, she understood what the creatures had been waiting for. She had already surrendered, and now she was part of the forest. The forest's heart, the world around Emma, had become a blur, a swirling vortex of shifting shadows and aching stillness. Her body felt weightless, as though it no longer belonged to her, but to something far older, far more powerful. The world was both distant and unbearably close, as if it were collapsing into a single point, a heartbeat echoing in the hollow chest of the forest. She could hear Nathan's voice calling her name, desperate, though his words felt like they were coming from the farthest reaches of her consciousness. She reached out, or thought she did, but there was nothing, just the unyielding weight of the forest, pressing down on her thoughts, erasing them bit by bit. The pull was unbearable. It was no longer just the creatures or the haunting words. They had become a part of her now. The forest's will was woven into her very being, twisting with her memories, making them unrecognizable, like half-formed dreams that evaporate upon waking. "Emma," Nathan's voice cracked, pulling her from the depths of the fog. His voice, it was her anchor, the last thing tethering her to the world she once knew. She tried to focus on it, to hold on to it, but the forest was everywhere now, infiltrating her mind, her body. It had always been here, beneath the earth, beneath the trees, beneath the very air she breathed. She could feel its pulse now, beating, Through the roots, through the dark soil, through her own veins. It was ancient, eternal, and it was hers. Emma. Nathan's voice was louder now, closer. She could hear him struggling, his breath ragged as if fighting something unseen. A flash of movement broke through the thick fog of her mind. Mark and Jenna too, their faces twisted with fear, their bodies frozen in place, caught in the same web. They too were succumbing, slowly. And yet, there was something different in Nathan's voice, something that pulled her attention back. "No, we are not staying. You're not part of this," Nathan screamed. His words were like a hammer, shattering the suffocating silence around her. For a moment, Emma felt a spark, a flicker of resistance, light up inside her. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to push back against the darkness. Enough to see clearly, if only for an instant. The fog in her mind parted, and she saw him. Nathan. Standing a few feet away, his hands outstretched as if trying to break through the walls of the forest itself. His eyes locked on hers with such raw desperation that it shook something deep within her. "Nathan," Emma whispered, but it was barely audible. She tried to move, to speak louder, but the weight of the forest pushed her down, crushed her under the flood of memories, images that weren't hers. The creatures, they were closing in. The twisting, broken figures, their black eyes gleaming. In the dim light, Emma could hear them whispering, not to her but to him, Nathan. They were trying to draw him in, trying to make him part of them too. And then, in the stillness that followed, there was a sound, a crack. Not from the creatures or the trees, but something deeper, something from the very heart of the forest. It was a whisper. "Let him go," it breathed. The voice was everywhere and nowhere at once. It was the sound of leaves rustling in a dead wind, the creak of old wood, the rattle of bones in the dark. The forest was speaking, its ancient voice reverberating through the very air. Emma's heart stopped. The creatures froze, their monstrous eyes flickering with confusion. And then, through the silence, the whisper grew louder, clearer. "Let him go, and you will stay." Her breath caught in her throat. The words sank deep like hooks, burrowing into her chest, filling her with an unbearable weight. Stay. The word had haunted her since they'd entered this place, but now it was different. It wasn't just an invitation. It was a bargain, a promise of something dark and terrible in exchange for everything. The creatures moved back, and for the briefest of moments, Emma could breathe again, free from the overwhelming pressure. Nathan was still standing, still fighting to reach her, but there was something in his face, a clarity. He knew what the forest wanted, and he wouldn't let it have her. "Emma," he called again, his voice steady now, more confident. "Don't listen to it. We're leaving, together." It was a strange thing, this clarity. It wasn't born from fear. It wasn't born from anger. It was a simple, undeniable truth. He would never leave her. And in that, there was a force stronger than the forest itself. Her pulse quickened. She could feel the pull again, but this time, it wasn't the forest's will she felt. It was Nathan's. His unwavering resolve, his refusal to be part of this world, was like a lifeline, pulling her back from the edge. She took a step forward, and then another. The ground trembled beneath her feet. The creatures growled, their eyes narrowing, but the power of Nathan's will was enough. The dark pulse of the forest began to slow, its grip weakening as she moved one step after another. The forest screamed, but it was a distant sound now, fading away with every inch she gained. Finally, Emma reached him. Nathan's hand shot out and he grasped hers, his touch steady, warm, and real. For a moment, nothing else mattered. Only him. Only this moment of connection. "Let's go," he whispered, and in his voice was the sound of breaking chains, of freedom. But just as they turned to run, the ground beneath them cracked. A deep, resonant rumble filled the air, and Emma felt the world shift violently around her. The creatures surged forward, but this time there was no hesitation in their movement. They were no longer whispering, they were screaming. A wave of darkness crashed down, engulfing them, and then, as if by some ancient magic, the world split. Emma felt herself falling, twisting through a tunnel of light and shadow, the world shattering and reassembling around her. The scream of the forest was deafening, but so was the voice in her mind, the voice of the ancient forest itself. Stay. She wanted to fight it, but it was too strong, too powerful. The pull was insistent, relentless, and in the blackness she couldn't see Nathan anymore. She couldn't see anything. But then there was a flicker, a light in the distance, a figure standing at the edge of the forest. The woman with the silver hair, her black eyes gleaming with dark knowledge. And then, darkness. The forest had claimed its prize. Nathan woke in the cold, the biting wind of the Smoky Mountains pressing against his skin. His chest tightened as he gasped for breath. His eyes darted around, his pulse thudding in his ears. The others, Mark, Jenna, Emma, were nowhere to be seen. He was alone, standing on a trail he didn't remember taking, a trail that looked so normal, so ordinary. But as he stared down at the ground, his heart sank. A single wooden signpost stood before him, its face dark and weathered, with just one word carved into it: stay. And somewhere, far in the distance, the whisper of the forest still echoed, soft and haunting. The return Nathan's breath came in shallow gasps as he stood at the base of the unmarked trail, staring at the sign. The word stay stared back at him, burned into his mind. His heart was a relentless thump in his chest, his legs frozen in place by a primal, gut-deep dread. He hadn't wanted to return. Not after what had happened, after they had disappeared into that shadow, that blackness. He had hoped, prayed, that he could leave it all behind. But the forest had other plans. The air around him was thick, as if the very atmosphere had been changed, warped by something unnatural. The wind did not move. The trees stood rigid, their branches like broken fingers stretching into a dull, grey sky. The Smoky Mountains had never felt so oppressive. The weight of the forest's presence was stifling. Every breath Nathan took tasted of dust and decay. He forced himself to turn away from the sign. But every step felt wrong, as though he wasn't meant to leave. That if he moved too far, if he ignored the pull, the forest would reach out and drag him back. The world around him was unnervingly still, too quiet for the deep woods. Not a bird chirped, not a squirrel darted between the trees. The only sounds were the dull scrape of his boots against the trail and the beating of his own heart. The stay sign was behind him now, but it loomed in his mind like a shadow he couldn't escape. It wasn't long before the first crack in reality appeared. Nathan's foot struck something hard on the trail. He looked down, expecting a rock or a root, but instead his eyes fell upon a small, well-worn pack. It looked familiar. Too familiar. The pack was weathered, but well kept, straps tightly secured, gear neatly organized. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled. He bent down slowly, dread filling his chest, and unbuckled the flap. Inside there were maps, crumpled, half-torn maps of the Smoky Mountains, but the trails marked on them. These weren't trails he had seen before. These were trails he hadn't seen before. Trails that didn't exist. And then, nestled beneath the maps, was a single object that made his blood freeze, a flashlight. Its metal body was scratched and faded with use. The brand was unfamiliar, as though it didn't belong to this world. He didn't know why, but his hands shook as he picked it up, flipping the switch. The beam of light illuminated the area ahead, right where he had just been standing, and he saw it, not with his eyes but through the light. A figure. It stood between two trees just at the edge of his vision, its form hidden in the shadows. A shape, a silhouette, too tall and too still to be anything natural. Nathan's pulse quickened. He had seen that figure before, in his dreams. The light flickered as the figure stepped forward, just out of reach of the beam's glow. It was a woman, with silver hair cascading down her back like a waterfall of moonlight. She moved with an unnatural grace, as though her feet barely touched the ground. Her eyes, black as the void, gleamed in the darkness. But this time there was no serenity in her face, no peace. Her lips parted, revealing a slow, deliberate smile. And the words that came from her mouth were not words of comfort, not promises of peace. You shouldn't have left. The voice wasn't the same voice from before. It wasn't the calm, ancient tone. It was sharp, twisted, dripping with a sense of malevolent joy. Nathan stumbled back, his hand trembling against the flashlight, his mind struggling to grasp the horror in front of him. No, you can't be real. This is just a nightmare. The woman's form flickered, like a distorted reflection in a pool of water. And then, with a slow, deliberate step, she was closer. The flashlight's beam cut through the night. But she was beyond it now, right in front of him, her figure emerging from the shadows like a terrible omen. Her voice was like ice, cold and eternal. You left them, but you can never leave the forest. It knows you. It's already taken them. You just don't realize it yet. The flashlight slipped from Nathan's hand, falling to the ground with a dull thud. His legs shook beneath him, his body overwhelmed by the pull of terror. The woman stepped forward once more. You can't escape what you've become. Nathan's breath hitched. What have I become? She smiled again. Part of it. The ground beneath him trembled. The trees seemed to shift, their gnarled roots twisting and writhing like serpents. The air grew thick, cloying, and the earth felt like it was alive. The same sensation he had felt deep in the heart of the forest before everything had gone dark, before Emma and the others had vanished. It was happening again. But this time, he was alone. There was no one to save him. The woman's figure grew more and more distorted, flickering in and out of focus, her image shifting like an old photograph burning in the flames. The forest around him began to bend, the trees groaning with a familiar, unnatural sound. The air felt like it was closing in on him, and with each breath, the world around him seemed to draw tighter, closer, more oppressive. You should have stayed, the woman whispered, her voice now hollow and distorted, like it was coming from within his own mind. Nathan's heart thundered in his chest. He wanted to run, to scream, to escape, but his legs refused to obey. He was rooted to the ground, caught in the same trap that had claimed the others, and then, without warning, the world broke apart. The earth split open beneath him. The trees twisted violently, and a deafening roar filled the air, a sound like the shriek of 1,000 souls being torn from their bodies. The woman's figure disintegrated, fading into the shifting chaos. Nathan reached out, his fingers grasping at the air, desperate for something to hold on to. But it was too late. With one final scream, the ground swallowed him whole. Lingering conclusion. When Nathan awoke, the world was quiet once again. The air was thick and heavy, but no longer suffocating. He found himself lying on the trail, face pressed against the cold, damp earth. His body ached, his mind groggy as though waking from a long, haunted dream. The sign stood before him again. Stay. But this time Nathan didn't feel the pull of the forest. He didn't feel the weight of its presence pressing on his chest. This time, Nathan stood up, his legs weak but steady, and he walked past the sign. He didn't look back. But deep in the woods, hidden among the dark, twisted trees, a whisper floated on the wind, and it called his name. The echo of silence. Nathan's heart pounded as he walked, the weight of his every step feeling heavier with each passing moment. The trail seemed endless, winding its way through the trees, the air dense with a suffocating quiet that filled his ears with the sound of his own breath. The forest around him had become something more than just a collection of trees and leaves. It was a living, breathing entity. Every branch, every crackling leaf felt like it was watching him, waiting, listening. He had hoped that leaving the sign behind would have freed him from the forest's grip. He had tried to ignore the fear that had taken root deep inside him, tried to convince himself that it was all in his mind. But the truth was inescapable. He wasn't free. The forest had marked him, and it had its claws in his soul. The further he walked, the more distorted the world seemed. The trees were no longer simply trees. They were twisted, bent into grotesque shapes that seemed to loom over him like the gnarled fingers of a corpse. Their bark was peeling away, revealing an inky blackness beneath, as if the trees themselves had been corrupted, infected by something dark and ancient. Nathan's pulse quickened. He could feel it now, the presence. It was as if the very earth was alive, shifting beneath him, pulling at him, calling him back to that place. That thing, the forest. The deeper he went, the louder the silence became. It wasn't just the absence of sound, but the overwhelming presence of nothingness. There was no wind, no birds, no rustling leaves. It was as though the world had collapsed into itself, leaving only him and the oppressive, watchful forest. He stumbled, his foot catching on something half buried in the undergrowth. He cursed under his breath and knelt down, brushing away the leaves. His fingers brushed against cold stone, and with a shock of recognition, he pulled away a small, weathered plaque. He turned it over, his stomach sinking as he read the words inscribed upon it. "You never leave. You only wander." He swallowed hard, his throat dry, the weight of the words pressing down on him. It was the same message, the same feeling that had followed him ever since he had entered this place. The sense that he wasn't just lost, he was being kept. That no matter how far he walked, no matter how many trails he crossed, the forest would always find him. He stood up slowly, a deep unease settling in his gut. Something was wrong. Something had changed. The air itself seemed to thrum with an unnatural energy, and then a sound. At first, it was soft, barely noticeable, like a whisper carried on the wind. Nathan froze, his senses alert. His gaze swept over the trees, searching for the source of the noise. There was nothing, just the endless stretch of dark woods, the twisted trunks, the black gaping voids between them. But then it came again, a low, guttural sound, like a growl. He turned sharply, scanning the darkness, but saw nothing. The trees were still, silent. And then, the whisper again, louder this time, like a voice that wasn't quite a voice. It was all around him, the sound so close it felt as if it was coming from within his own mind. "Leave." Nathan took a step back, his breath catching in his throat. The growl came again, and this time there was no mistaking it. It wasn't just an animal, it wasn't natural. It was wrong. The sound scraped against his nerves, sending shivers of dread down his spine. Without thinking, he turned and began to run. His legs burned with effort, his heart racing in his chest. The forest seemed to close in around him, the trees pressing tighter, their dark branches reaching for him like skeletal arms. The growl came again, louder, angrier this time. And then Something else. The ground trembled beneath his feet, as if the earth itself was alive. Nathan didn't dare to look back. He just ran, his feet pounding the soft earth, his breath ragged in his chest. The sound of the growl echoed in his mind, filling his ears with an overwhelming roar that seemed to reverberate through his very bones. He could hear something chasing him now, something moving faster than he could. The darkness swallowed him whole. Then a flash of movement. A shape darted between the trees, too fast for him to follow. Nathan's blood ran cold. Whatever was out there, whatever it was hunting him. The very thought of it made him want to stop running, to fall to his knees and beg for mercy. But he knew that there would be no mercy. Not here, not in the forest. And then something else. A voice. "You shouldn't have left." It was a whisper, but it wasn't in his ear. It was inside his mind. A voice he recognized. Emma. His heart skipped a beat. His legs faltered. The memory of her, of their time together, of the last moments they had shared in the forest, before everything had changed, overwhelmed him. He reached for the ground, his hands scraping against the cold, hard earth as he stumbled, the memories flooding back. He could feel her presence again, as if she were standing right beside him, calling him back. But there was something wrong with her, something wrong with them. His eyes scanned the woods, his breath shallow and quick. The air seemed thick with something terrible, something ancient, and he couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching. Him, waiting for him to return to them. A flash of silver caught his eye. A figure standing just at the edge of the trees, its face obscured by shadows. But there was no mistaking the silver hair. It was her. Emma. Emma? Nathan gasped, his voice choked with disbelief. "Emma, is it really you?" The figure tilted its head, the corners of its lips curling upward into a smile that wasn't Emma's. It was the same hollow smile he had seen before, the same dark eyes. Not her, not anymore. "You shouldn't have left," the voice repeated. But this time it wasn't Emma's voice. It was something else. Something darker. And then, in a flash of horrifying clarity, Nathan understood. The forest hadn't just taken them. It had changed them. It had consumed them, twisted them into something new, something unrecognizable. The ground beneath him trembled again. He could feel the earth shifting, the pulse of the forest growing stronger, deeper, as if it were drawing him in, pulling him back to the heart of it. He had been marked. He couldn't leave. He tried to run again, but the forest had other plans. The trees seemed to move, their trunks bending, their roots reaching out to ensnare him, to drag him into the ground. His feet were suddenly stuck, as if the earth itself had come alive and grabbed hold of him. "Stay," the voice whispered. Again, now a chorus of many voices, all of them familiar. "You'll never leave. You'll never escape." The silver-haired figure stepped forward, her black eyes gleaming with malice. Nathan's legs gave way beneath him, and he fell to his knees. The forest was all around him now, pressing in, suffocating him, binding him to its eternal hunger. And somewhere, deep within the darkness, he heard the final words. "Stay. Forever." The forest waited, its pulse still strong in the quiet, dark. The unmarked trail stretched out into the endless unknown, its twisting path leading deeper into the shadows. The forest had claimed another. But even as the wind whispered through the trees, there was a subtle shift, a change in the air, for now it was still, silent. But the hunger was never truly gone. The final mark Nathan's eyes flickered open, and for a moment, the world around him felt still, too still. The darkness was absolute, pressing in on him, consuming him whole. He couldn't move. His body was numb, frozen by the grip of the forest, its roots twisted into his flesh, its breath cold and unforgiving. The weight of its presence was so suffocating that he could barely remember how to breathe. But something else stirred within him, something deeper than fear. A desperate, aching hunger for escape. A single thought burned through his mind, louder than all the whispers, louder than the growl, louder than the voice of the woman in the silver hair. I can't stay here. His chest tightened, the sense of suffocation clawing at his throat as he tried to pull himself from the earth, but the ground held him tight. He was sinking into it like quicksand, like the very soil had come alive and was pulling him down into its black, endless heart. But then, something broke through. A flicker of light. A crack in the darkness. It was faint at first, like a distant star shining through a thick, suffocating fog. He turned toward it, instinctively, even as the roots dug deeper into his legs. The ground shifted beneath him, its grip tightening. But the light was there. Brighter now, steady, flickering like the flame of a candle fighting against the dark. And then, from within the light, he heard a voice. It wasn't Emma's. It wasn't the woman's. It was his. "You can leave," Nathan heard himself say, though his voice sounded distant, like it was coming from far away. He blinked, confused. It wasn't his voice, but it felt like it should have been. It felt like the voice of someone who had been lost for so long, and had finally found their way back. The light grew stronger, and Nathan could feel something shifting, something being undone. The roots that had bound him began to loosen. His legs, though still heavy, felt free for the first time since he had stepped onto this cursed trail. "Leave," the voice repeated, but this time, it wasn't just his. It was a chorus, 1,000 voices, all woven together, all rising in harmony, urging him forward. It wasn't just the forest calling him back, it was something else, something he had never noticed before, something deeper than the earth beneath his feet. His gaze shifted to the center of the light, where the figure stood. The silver-haired woman was there again, her face twisted into that same mocking smile. But now she was different. There was a crack in her, a flaw in her form, as though the darkness itself was slipping through her like water through a broken dam. And there, beside her, standing motionless, were the others. Emma, the others who had vanished with her, their eyes hollow, their forms twisted by the forest. They were shadows of who they once were, like puppets bound by invisible strings, lost and fractured by time. But Emma was still the one who haunted him the most. She looked at him with those empty eyes, her lips trembling with unspoken words. But Nathan understood now. They weren't just lost in the forest, they were a part of it. Nathan's chest tightened, his heart squeezing with a deep, aching pain. He reached toward her, his hands trembling, but his body still refused to obey. His fingers brushed against the soil, feeling the cool, damp earth as the voices around him grew louder, more insistent. "You have to leave now," the voice, their voice, urged again. "You don't belong here anymore, you never did." His thoughts were scattered, memories tumbling over one another. He remembered the first time he had crossed the boundary into this place, the sense of curiosity that had drawn him into the forest. He had been searching for something he couldn't even define. Maybe it was closure, maybe it was a sense of purpose, but all he had found was this horror, this madness. And now, in this final moment, it was clear. The forest had never just been a place. It had always been a curse. It was alive, but not in the way the world was alive. It was a hunger, a pull, an ancient being that existed only to consume, to grow, to feed. And those who entered, those who stayed, became part of it. But Nathan wasn't like them. He wasn't meant to be consumed. He pushed harder against the earth, ignoring the tightening grip of the forest. His arms burned, his legs screamed in pain, but he would not stay. The light grew brighter, and for the first time since he had entered the forest, Nathan felt the forest begin to recoil. The ground trembled again, but this time it wasn't in anger. It was in retreat. "You don't belong here," the voice said softer now. "Leave while you still can." And Nathan did. With one final, desperate surge of strength, he broke free. The forest tried to hold him, tried to pull him back, but the light surged through him, cutting through the darkness. He pushed past the memories, past the figures that reached for him, past the twisted trees, until the air around him was no longer suffocating, until the shadows were behind him, retreating into the distance. He was free. The forest faded behind him, its grip loosening, its call fading to a distant murmur. He ran, breath ragged, his body trembling with exhaustion, his heart pounding with both fear and relief. When he finally stumbled out into the clearing, the sky was no longer grey and oppressive. It was dark, but not in the way it had been. No, longer the suffocating weight of 1,000 eyes watching from the shadows. The stars were visible now, shining bright and cold against the velvet black sky. Nathan fell to his knees, gasping for air, the world around him still and silent. The forest loomed in the distance, but he knew now he had left it. For good, or had he? He raised his hand to his chest, feeling the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart. He was alive. He was free. But something lingered. A cold sensation crept over him. A shadow stretched out from the trees, moving faster than he could see, slithering across the ground toward him, touching his feet. The faintest of whispers echoed in his ears. "You will always be marked." He looked down, his stomach sinking as a shadow writhed beneath his skin, twisting, tightening like a brand, like a scar. He had escaped, but it wasn't over. Not really. The forest had its mark on him, and no matter how far he ran, how far he went, it would never truly let him go. The stars above twinkled coldly, indifferent to Nathan's plight, and in the distance, the unmarked trail lay dormant, still, waiting for the next soul to wander too far into its grasp. Some places, some things never let you leave, not completely.